The sight across from the train station was one that had become depressingly more common over time. A giant rampaging villain, angrily swiping at pro-heroes trying to manage him. Other heroes blocking the road, keeping a crowd of interested civilians away from the destruction. Most of the onlookers watched in awe or fear, and a few with the boredom of connoisseurs seeing something that wasn't exciting. But one young student, with fluffy green hair and dark green eyes with notebook in hand, watched the carnage with an expression that didn't really match any other emotion that was on display. The fight was over as quickly as it began. Kamui Woods attempted to use his signature lacquered chain prison to bind the villain, when the huge villain was blindsided by a similarly giant lady. As the newly revealed Mount Lady began her grand debut with photographers, professional and amateur, surrounding her, the young man kept taking notes. Interesting mirror match. It's kind of like those old Marvel films. I mean, having that kind of nemesis can really set the expectations of the fights you're going to undertake as a pro. But how does her quirk work? Can she only go to those extreme sizes, or can she ratchet it up degree by degree? Maybe she never thought about it and can only do that, and that guy was really not a very good fighter. Hey, whoa there, kid! The teenager blinked, turning to look at the older man with the stars on his head. Blinking, he snapped his notebook shut. Oh, sorry about that. The older man smiled. Can't blame you. You aiming to be a hero like them? I'd say with a head on your shoulders like that, you'd be a great hero. The teenager laughed, putting the notebook back in his bag. Yeah, something like that. He checked his phone and then winced. Better hurry, I don't want to be late for school. I was 4 when I learned that the world wasn't fair. I was born without a quirk, without powers, something that every other person around me took for granted. The feeling was crushing. Maybe the lesson I should have taken is that we can't always have what we want. But I didn't take that away from my experiences. All my life, I've looked up to heroes like All Might. But sometimes looking at heroes, I felt that they weren't super enough. Sure, heroes saved people from disasters and helped deal with villains, but I always thought that villains were more people who didn't think about the system. They were just people lashing out and not really acting like the guys in books. I thought about this for days, wondering what made the difference. What made All Might stand above the rest of the heroes? It was when I was looking through the old comic books from before the days of quirks that it hit me. A hero doesn't mean very much without a villain to contrast them. You could almost say that villains defined the heroes. Without a villain, heroes don't spring into action. From there, my mind was on fire. If all heroes could get a foe worthy of the name, somebody who could push them above and beyond, make them go plus ultra, then everything would be better. Well, I wasn't interested in people actually getting hurt. Maybe people did get hurt, but I would much rather they didn't. But then, I got an inspiration. The classroom was in a state of tension. Despite the students sitting at their desks calmly, there was an undeniable buzz in the air. The sight of an actual hero-villain battle had pumped people up. Sure enough, when the teacher came in and pulled out the career forms, the buzz died down. Now then, you're all third years, so it's time for you all to start thinking seriously about your futures. The class shifted in their seats. Their teacher looked through the forms in hand. Normally, I would hand out these career forms. However, he then threw the papers in the air. I guess you all want to be heroes. There was a great uproar from the rest of the class. Flamethrower arms were lit. Eyeballs, fingers and necks were extended. But there were 2 islands of relative calm amidst the chaos. One, a spiky-haired blonde with a cocksure grin, the other with fluffy green hair, who was idly tinkering with something small and mechanical on his desk that looked vaguely like some sort of armband. Come on, teach. Don't lump me in with the rest of these extras. Bakugo Katsuki bragged, hands in pockets and feet on desk. As the class turned its ire on him and he responded in kind, the green-haired kid continued fiddling with the device, a small smile on his face. Oh yes, Midoriya. You applied for UA as well, didn't you? The air seemed to freeze, all eyes in the classroom being dragged over to the young man. Upon realizing he was the center of attention, he simply pointed at himself. As the stares continued, he smiled just a bit wider. Oh, yes! That's right. Midoriya nodded, wiping the device down with a rag. I'm aiming for the support course. I knew that since I was quirkless, I was unlikely to get into the hero course. I wasn't too interested in that, though knowing about hero training might have made it easier for my future, it wasn't necessary. I had always been interested in those crazy machines that the villains in those stories had usually built. Dr. Doom, Lex Luthor, Mr. Freeze, Dr. Octopus. The thought of making something like that was really, really cool. And so I decided to throw myself at learning how to make cool robots and laser guns. It wasn't easy, I have to say that much. Even though I was bright for my age, it was an uphill struggle. There's a lot that goes into engineering and robotics, but I persevered, kept up the hard work, and soon I was doing pretty well with my gizmos and gadgets, if I do say so myself. Had to learn a bunch of other stuff, chemistry, a bit of coding, physics, but in the end I did quite well. I also joined a few clubs in school. Drama club was fun. There were still some plays being done from the time before Quirks and I fit in, particularly in the dramatic roles. The robotics club in school was pretty interesting, and there was always a lot of stuff from the school labs to use for my other purposes. Midoriya? In UA? I guess if he's entering the support course, he'll get in. All those weird gadgets of his, like that flashy light thing, are pretty cool, but still, he is quirkless. That word tended to come up around Izuku a lot. He really wanted to shrug it off or own it, but he hadn't built himself up to that point. Bakugo turned around like the wrath of God, glaring at Izuku. Bakugo's red-eyed stare was met with a flat green one. With a flash of motion and explosive light, Bakugo slammed his hand on the desktop, narrowly missing the gadget there. You? Forget crappy quirks like theirs. You're totally quirkless. What makes you think you can get in, huh? Ka-chan, I'm aiming for support, not the hero course. I'm not going to be competing with you on that front, Izuku explained calmly. He might as well have poured water on a grease fire. Bakugo's palms popped with barely restrained explosions, and the growling coming from his throat wouldn't have been out of place coming from a rabid animal. The teacher hurriedly called for order, and class resumed as normally as it would normally. The day went by in a blur, the other students glancing around, knowing that a showdown was inevitable. Soon enough, the day ended. Izuku started to pack his books away when a certain presence made itself known. Izuku sighed. Ka-chan. We ain't done, Deku. Bakugo picked up the notebook, glancing at it idly. Hero analysis for my future, huh? Izuku winced. Well, if I'm going into support, I need to know what sorts of things. Bakugo slammed his hand on Izuku's desktop. Bullshit, Deku. You are aiming for the hero course. His open palm started to smoke against the wooden desk. I told you to stay out of my way, damn it, Izuku sighed. I'm not getting in your way, Ka-chan. Just listen, and please give me back my book, all right? Bakugo looked him in the eye with a flat expression. Then quickly, he slammed the book between both hands with a mighty bang. Izuku jumped a bit as Katsuki threw the book out the window. Stay out of my way. Don't you dare get into the hero course, or I'll crush you there. He left, hands shoved firmly in his pockets. Izuku watched him go and sighed. Ka-chan, you really need to get a proper villain. You've kind of stayed in this whole anti-hero thing for way too long. Izuku ran down to grab his book before all of the notes contained within got washed away. There's some good stuff in there. Honestly, Ka-chan, do you have to be so obsessed? Still, Ka-chan hadn't been entirely wrong. Izuku was planning to get in his way at some point, just not in the way that Ka-chan had thought. Izuku had a bit of a chuckle about that on the way home. Passers-by kept a bit of a wide berth around the maniacally giggling teenager. Ka-chan. We ain't done, Deku. Bakugo picked up the notebook, glancing at it idly. Hero analysis for my future, huh? Izuku winced. Well, if I'm going into support, I need to know what sorts of things. Bakugo slammed his hand on Izuku's desktop. Bullshit, Deku. You are aiming for the hero course. His open palm started to smoke against the wooden desk. I told you to stay out of my way, damn it, Izuku sighed. I'm not getting in your way, Ka-chan. Just listen, and please give me back my book, all right? Bakugo looked him in the eye with a flat expression. Then quickly, he slammed the book between both hands with a mighty bang. Izuku jumped a bit as Katsuki threw the book out the window. "Stay out of my way. Don't you dare get into the hero course, or I'll crush you there." He left, hands shoved firmly in his pockets. Izuku watched him go and sighed. "Kachin, you really need to get a proper villain. You've kind of stayed in this whole anti-hero thing for way too long." Izuku ran down to grab his book before all of the notes contained within got washed away. "There's some good stuff in there. Honestly, Kachan, do you have to be so obsessed?" Still, Kachan hadn't been entirely wrong. Izuku was planning to get in his way at some point, just not in the way that Kachan had thought. Izuku had a bit of a chuckle about that on the way home. Passers-by kept a bit of a wide berth around the maniacally giggling teenager. The gear he'd made, all ready. The research, carefully plotted, with no less than 3 entry and exit strategies. The presentation, the costume was at the ready, carefully handmade. Smoke machines were at the ready. Or was that folded into gear? Izuku looked himself over in the mirror. The gear was crude, but it would work for now. He'd had to take some stuff from the school tech labs, slowly and carefully so nobody would suspect. He'd also made use of the dumping ground at the Musutafu beach. The costume he'd made was a tabard and cloak, primarily a light teal color with black accents on the edges. It was secured by a tool belt crudely painted red and with extra pouches quickly attached. Underneath, there was a crude set of body armor, dark gray steel that formed a pair of large boots and a set of gauntlets. The cloak itself had a series of red dots on the hood and fluttered dramatically in the wind, even though it was indoors. Izuku's face was covered by a green half-mask with a crude red visor shielding his eyes. "Yes, this looks great. Now," he started to giggle, then chuckle. He reached into his belt pocket and pulled out a small remote. "The world of heroes best prepare, for I am the supervillain known as." Izuku paused. "I know I had a name. He flicked through his notebooks, becoming more frantic as he did so. "Damn, all the really good villain names are taken. Gotta be something good. Wait." A name came to mind. Izuku paused in his mumbling. Yeah, that'll work." He readied the remote. "I am the supervillain known as Mastermind." He clicked the remote. Thunder rumbled. Issue 2, Supervillain Debut. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Toshinori Yagi, better known as All Might, had to admit that there were times when he was honestly confused. Usually those times were things like young fans asking him about his quirk or Nedzu's ranting about teaching. Even the #1 hero could be confused sometimes, in spite of his lengthy experiences. He had been going down the road, form diminished. His time had gone out, and he was stuck as ordinary Yagi, All Might's personal secretary. The sludge villain was still imprisoned in the empty soda bottles he had hastily repurposed. The student that he had saved and gifted an autograph had wanted to grab him and keep fanboying. He could tell that, but his time had been steadily shrinking. He'd made a safe landing and was just on the way to the police station when he saw a short figure in a rather garish costume striding purposefully to an office building he vaguely recognized as a support industry one. With a teal cape and red visor over what looked like medieval armor, the figure had a rather loud color scheme. A small crowd had gathered nearby, watching this latest. Pro? Maybe? Toshinori honestly couldn't remember all of the new heroes that came out. His mind blurred, trying to remember if this was a pro he'd met before. The short figure stopped near the door, mumbling something near inaudible. Then, it extended a hand and pushed through the door. The man strode through, cape fluttering dramatically in the breeze. He then spoke, in a loud and synthesized voice, sounding like an angry robot. "Mwah! Tremble, Makoto Industries, for you are being robbed by Urk." This last bit was said because, just as he wound up for it, the door closed behind him. It snagged the fluttering cape and pulled the figure back. Toshinori had been told that he wasn't allowed to drink for his health. After this, he wanted a second opinion. The building that Izuku had chosen for his debut as Mastermind had needed quite a bit of research. Makoto Industries had a couple of offices around the country. They sold cheap support gear to heroes who needed it. Their gear was reputed to be of high quality. Izuku's digging told him more. Still, he had needed to confirm it, and when he had, he knew that here was where he needed to debut. After freeing his cape from the wretched prison known as a door, he glared, coughed. Come on, Mastermind. This is what all those years at the Drama Society were for. Ahem. As I was saying, tremble at the hands of Mastermind. Thunder roared. The various employees stared at this short figure in their midst, who was even now striding forwards towards the larger tech labs. This stillness lasted for just a moment, then they sprung into action. One of the employees leveled a rather bulky-looking support item, what looked like a small arm-mounted cannon, at the approaching villain. "Halt!" he yelled. One of his coworkers was already reaching over to the panic button on the desk. "If you go any further..." "You'll what?" Mastermind asked pleasantly. Idly, Mastermind clenched a fist, and some small lights lit up on the gauntlet's knuckles. The office worker readied the cannon, a small light building in its center, and then Izuku tapped his palm. Doomph! A pulse shot out, and all of the lights in the building went out to the sound of screaming. In front of him, he just saw the piece of gear being primed, and then it stopped with a dying hum. There was a general cursing and clicking from the direction ahead of Mastermind. His visor lit up, scanning the area around him. It was crude and rude heat signatures, along with a mini-map of the building guiding his progress, but it was enough. Quickly, Mastermind ran for the main labs. The man in front of him tried to body block him, but a swift blow to the man's protruding stomach with his gauntleted fist, and he went down like a sack of dropped rice. "Shit! Emp! He's got an electrical quirk." Mastermind shook his head. "Fools! Now that your security grid is down, I am free to pilfer your heroic secrets." He then bowed. "Now, please excuse me. The lights should be coming back on in a few minutes, so try to remain calm." The lab was just over here. Now for the next part. Izuku reckoned he didn't have long before the EMP wore off, so he had to act now. He tapped at a small screen on his right hand. The items he had planted before all of this should work, if he'd properly shielded them. It had taken him a little bit of rather disgusting thievery, but he'd managed to swipe some of Kachan's old gym socks. Since the blonde sweat was always a nitroglycerin compound, it was an expenditure that he would not have to make in future. The doors to the lab exploded, adding yet more chaos to the area. Mastermind knew that nobody would be too close to the doors of the lab, since all of the security guards were hampered by the doors being shut down. Quickly, he headed to the main vault of the lab, grabbing as many items of tech as he could. An idle scan, and he made sure that what he'd grabbed was the best items. Curiously, he left some items that looked to be of the same quality as others he had taken. Objective? Secured. Escape? Already working on it. Mastermind grinned and charged back out the way he came. Yagi was having a small fit about his weakness. He'd used all of his time today, and he couldn't draw on even a drop of it when there were people in danger right now. Come on, one for all. Just one more minute, please. The lights in the building had gone off, and suddenly there was just chaos. People in the street jostling each other, panicking and wondering where the heroes were. For Toshinori Yagi, the whole situation was just a bit ironic. Somebody collided with him particularly hard and fell down, dislodging the bag that Yagi had been using to hold the bottles of Villian in. But even in his diminished state, Toshinori couldn't just abandon somebody who needed help. "Are you all right?" He helped the man up, dusted him off. Yeah." The young man looked over at the scene. "Damn, who'd be dumb enough to rob a support building in broad daylight? All Might's gonna crush this idiot." Yagi winced. "Yeah, I think he will." Something about this whole situation seemed strange. Normally, Toshinori could force the embers to light up, but this time, his gut just didn't seem to be in it. As he watched as workers started coming out, trying fruitlessly to reach emergency services, the young man started to glance around on the ground with what seemed like panic. "Ah, sorry." The young man bowed to Yagi. "I'm really sorry, sir." Yagi blinked, trying to reassure him. "Sorry about what?" I accidentally used my quirk on that bag." The poor man sounded panicked. "I am really sorry." "My bag?" Yagi blinked, then looked for his bag, which had gone missing. He turned around. "What happened to it?" "That's the thing. My quirk. I can only teleport small objects. I usually use it to put my shopping away. It should be nearby." Like, He looked sheepish. 50 meters? He chewed on his finger. Sometimes it's gone further, but that's usually on a good day. Yagi's eyes widened. Shit. His head whipped around, trying to see where it could have gone. Then the front door of the office opened, and out strode the villain, Mastermind. Yagi watched as he seemed to almost pose in the doorway, cape fluttering and accompanied by a burst of smoke coming out from his cape, apparently. The great Mastermind absconds with this precious hero support gear, and the heroes haven't even shown their faces yet. Another boom of thunder. Yagi saw a tiny remote in the figure's hand. Was that a machine they'd built? And another maniacal peal of laughter followed. But now I must go. The heroes haven't heard the last of Mastermind. Please let them know. And with that, the villain turned to leave, a bag of spoils in his hand. The police showed up, but apparently he had been expecting that. Suddenly, the smoke around him exploded outwards, covering the area. Toshinori thought he heard sounds, a clash in there. When the smoke cleared, the villain was gone. The police looked around, shouting, but there was nobody to be seen. Yagi's fists clenched at his side. A villain attack right in front of him, and he couldn't do anything. He just stood there. And now, there was an explosion from far off. Toshinori's head whipped around to the sound. Oh no. Mastermind was honestly a bit disappointed that no heroes had shown up. Talk about a waste of time, he muttered. Still, at least he had the items he had been looking for. He needed to improve his costume. He knew that much. He had actually taken the simplest means of escape, which had been to deploy the full smokescreen and then swing onto the rooftops. He'd practiced that maneuver with the grappling hook for weeks until he'd been confident of pulling it off. Mastermind had quite thoroughly scouted out the area beforehand and had made sure to stay 2 steps ahead. A drone was waiting for him on this specific rooftop. He placed the spoils in the waiting box and then tapped a few more buttons. The drone's outer shell flickered, then changed to a conventional delivery drone, just one of dozens already out there. As it flew off, Mastermind swung ahead with the grappling gun. This was kind of proving his point. Heroes needed to be one top of these things. Maybe he'd let off the EMP too early? No, he'd been careful about the size of the EMP only affecting the area in the building. He'd mapped the place out pretty thoroughly. I knew that it was going to be difficult to get started as a brilliant villain. You needed resources, you needed genius, you needed preparation. So I prepared. I did all of my homework as thoroughly as I could. If there was a historic villain I was mimicking, it was the Uncanny Thief, Oji Harima. Destro's work was a bit iffy. He had some really weird ideas about quirkless people, referring to them as less than human in the original printing, and most other villains were only in it for fun and profit. There were a few vigilantes as well, some people who didn't fit into the system, but I could respect the Uncanny Thief's aims. I didn't have much in the way of conclusive proof about it, but I spotted a trend. Heroes with Makoto Industries gear had a higher rate of injury. They claimed it was because their gear got damaged in the fights, but I suspected something was up. So I took inspiration, surprisingly enough, from a character from well before the time of quirks, Arsène Lupin. A master of disguise, of being underestimated. He never hurt anybody with his stunts and always gave flowers to a woman even when robbing her blind. I had a couple of jobs that I applied for. One false beard, a stoop, glasses, and some hair dye later, and I was janitor Benji, just looking for work. Makoto Industries had been hiring a janitor, and I was able to get in by appealing to the manager's sensibilities. That I said I was quirkless also helped. A few planted cameras and recording devices later, and I had been paid to map out their building and find the best entrances. Listening in only confirmed it. They were using substandard materials for some, but not all, of their gear to cut down on costs, usually given to newer heroes with less of a support network. Workers justified it as being part of the hustle. The customer gets what they paid for. Honestly, no wonder heroes aren't as super as they should be. They had also, similarly, been cheap on their security systems. No electromagnetic shielding for them. Maybe they figured that the heroes would always be there to guard them? So in the process of robbing them, I planned to leave the substandard gear for the inevitable police investigation, along with a few tapes of calls about heroes they were ripping off. The first thought that went through Mastermind's head when he heard the loud explosions was that Kachan had snapped and turned into a villain, which wasn't very fair. "How can I be his nemesis if we're both villains?" he muttered, swinging over. "I mean, really, Kachan, that was kind of the whole plan. You be the #1 hero when All Might retires. I make some terrible puns and menace you. I drive you to be the greatest hero of all time. That was the plan." He swung down to ground level, where he saw a large crowd forming. Behind him, he saw a rather skinny man looking at him with wide eyes, who looked like he had just run over to the scene as well. The man pointed at him. "You." He coughed up a torrent of blood, and Mastermind panicked. "Oh my God, sir? Are you okay? I have something for that. Please don't die. Oh my God, oh my God." For the second time today, Toshinori Yagi was flustered by something unusual, and by the same person, no less. Mastermind, the villain who'd attacked a support company in broad daylight and set off an explosion indoors apparently, anxiously fumbling in his tool pouch for a handkerchief while frantically babbling at him to stay calm. "Who? Why are you here?" Toshinori Yagi knew that he could stretch one for all. Just a moment of distraction, and he could take this villain out, make him reveal where he'd stashed his loot. But again, he just couldn't find it in his heart to get this villain, who even now had a handkerchief in hand, an All Might handkerchief of all things. The irony was not lost on Yagi. Yagi tried to speak, but the villain frantically shook his head. "Ah, sir, please don't talk more. You might cough up more blood." The villain pressed the handkerchief into Yagi's hands, his own stylized face staring up at him in an almost accusing manner. The villain's head whipped around. "Ah! Maybe a hero can help you." Another loud explosion cut them off, and with that, the voices of the heroes on duty started sounding through. Izuku was about to wipe the blood away from the protesting stranger's mouth when he heard the heroes talking. Backdraft, trying to keep the fires under control. Mount Lady, trying to get into position. Death Arms, arms crossed and a ferocious scowl on his face. "It's like a minefield out there. We can't even get close to him. That slime villain is too slippery to grab, but the boy with the explosive quirk is resisting him." Mastermind just stopped like a broken clock. "What?" The next words from the heroes hit him like a ton of bricks. "Damn! There's no one here who can stop him. We just have to hope for somebody with the right quirk shows up. Keep the damage to a minimum. We just need the kid to hang on." The skeletal blonde man next to him clutched his stomach with an anguished look in his eyes. Mastermind couldn't blame him. He was feeling pretty sick himself. Why weren't the heroes doing anything? Why were they just standing around, not trying anything? Furiously, Mastermind was about to go over to the heroes and give them a piece of his mind when across the smoke he met eyes with the victim. Kachan, with a look in his eyes that showed that he was terrified. Mastermind found that his body was moving on its own. Yagi was pretty sure that he'd nearly died of a heart attack when the villain suddenly lunged forwards, tearing towards the boy in the middle of the sludge villain. The other heroes seemed about to shout at him to stop, then seemed to think better. Yagi's eyes widened. After all, "Who's that pro?" Death Arms yelled. "Don't know. Maybe he's got the right quirk for the job." They'd made the same mistake as he had, and at that statement, it seemed that Mastermind almost sped up. Toshinori watched, agape, as the blonde was forced to swing around, palm outwards and sparking with heat. The villain ducked the explosion, the heat burning off some of the tabard, then reached out with an arm. A grappling hook shot out and dug into the slimy mass, wrapping around the teenager. You utter fool," Mastermind yelled. There was a press of buttons on the other hand, and suddenly there was a startlingly bright light flaring out from the gauntlet. The sludge villain howled, slime covering his eyes, and then Toshinori's heart leapt into his chest as he saw the grappling line recede. The sludge villain tried to follow, but the villain pulled something out of his belt. A small gun, white with a blue light on the end. A blast of blue energy hit the villain's bottom half, and then the sludge villain roared in pain. "What did you do to me? What did you do to me?" Looking closer, Toshinori could see that the bottom half of the sludge villain had frozen solid. Mastermind didn't answer him, instead continuing to reel the explosive blonde in. Why are you doing this? The hostage yelled, tears streaming down his face. Mastermind does not know, but I do know this. The villain braced himself against a piece of upturned concrete, both arms on the wire. It's a bad day for heroes when a villain has to do a hero's job. With one last tug, the blonde was free, Mastermind stumbling back before pushing more buttons on his gauntlet. The sludge villain roared, trying to push forwards, but the other heroes took action. Backdraft shot a fire hose stream of water at the villain, pushing him back. Before the villain could really recover, Death Arms had leapt into the fray. Charging up his might, the pro-hero unleashed a devastating series of punches, disrupting the villain's sludgy body. The villain, again, tried to recover, lunging at Death Arms in a last desperate attempt, but a fortunate save in the form of Mount Lady came through, an almighty stomp turning the villain into paste on the ground. Bleh. Her expression was one of disgust. And with the villain subdued, the crowd erupted into cheers for the heroes, along with a few mumbling that they wanted to be under her almighty heel. And Toshinori Yagi watched this small moment with a heavy heart. Toshinori just sighed. He was kind of pathetic, wasn't he? Letting that villain get away, not stopping this mastermind. But at least the heroes had managed to prevail here, in spite of his weakness. He cast a look at the villain again. He wondered what was going through the head of that villain. Izuku Midoriya had no idea why he'd done that. He'd just seen Kachan in need of help, and he just ran in. Was he losing his touch already? Was he going to perform a heel-face turn on day one of being a supervillain? Hey, are you a pro? He stiffened, turning to the crowd in front of him. This was so much more intimidating than the drama society. A whole stressful of people staring at him, and the pro-heroes were looking his way. Oh no. And there was that blood-coughing guy from before, looking at him with a look that was undecided on reproachful and confused. Oh God. What do I say? Take a deep breath. This is the moment. Make yourself known to the heroes. Not that hard. He turned around and walked to a specific spot he'd seen before. Showtime. Heh. Heh. Bakugo coughed and retched up more as he heard that oddly distorted voice start laughing. Around him, the pro-heroes tensed. The figure in front of him, the guy who'd saved him, started laughing, softly at first, shoulders shaking. Then, the shithead threw his head back and belted out a maniacal laugh, with his back arched and arms outstretched like he was some sort of goddamn supervillain or something. Mah! Fools! I am not a pro-hero. Rather, I am the master villain, known as Mastermind. Thunder roared even though it was a clear day as he continued laughing and smoke started coming out from his cloak. He changed his posture, dramatically pointing at the heroes. As I said, chose to come here, since I saw you were too weak to deal with such a pathetic villain. The heroes bristled, Mount Lady ready to grab the little man as he laughed once again. Death Arms banged his fists together, electrical sparks coming off of the action. Kamui Woods prepared to bind this villain. Bakugo wanted nothing more than to charge this giggling asshole, but there just wasn't much strength left in his body. He'd never let off so many explosions, and such strong ones at that. His arms and lungs felt like they were on fire, and he felt slightly lightheaded. Honestly, he felt like shit rather than the shit. Know this, heroes. I have already gotten away with stealing your precious support items at Makoto Industries. The heroes flinched back at that, if only a little. Yes, consider this a warning. You have not escaped yet from the brilliant machinations of... The heroes lunged forwards, but it was too late. Bakugo could only watch from the sidelines as suddenly the smoke burst out in a massive cloud, engulfing the entire crowd of bystanders and the alleyways around. He could only watch as the heroes charged in, with general cries of, "Where is he?" and "Call the police! Get a cordon up!" When the smoke cleared, the villain was gone. All that was left was a small black box, resting just a short distance away. The heroes watched it carefully, ready to throw the civilians away if it turned out to a bomb. The box squawked. The genius supervillain, Mastermind. With that, the box crumpled up on itself, dissolving into a thick sludge. The heroes searched the area, furiously calling police, organizing a search team. Bakugo could only stare at the ground where the villain had been. A manhole cover. Shit. He wanted to get up, but when he tried, the world spun in an unpleasant way. Fuck. He needed a drink of water. As he fell, he saw somebody coming up with what looked like a bottle of water. Tall guy, scraggly blonde hair, skinny as fuck. He would have been more judgmental, but the guy had a bottle of water. Greedily, he drank from it. When he felt like he wasn't going to die, he managed to get out, sewer grate, before returning to the bottle. The tall man just nodded. "Are you okay?" he asked. Bakugo scoffed. "First a villain and now this guy." "I'm fine. Just a bit tired." He would have sworn, but the guy had given him a bottle of water. "Kid, I have to say, you were incredible out there." One of the heroes came up to him, some guy in a bird mask. "And you've got such a great quirk, too. You want to be my sidekick once you graduate?" Bakugo looked away. Some hero he was, standing around doing fuck all. "Listen, I think the fucker went into the sewer system. That's where he stood. Over there." The hero looked over and then nodded. "You've got a good eye, kid. We'll check it out. You should probably get home." He grinned. "Check the news tonight. We're definitely going to get that villain." In the crowd, he briefly saw a head of green hair wandering off, but he dismissed it. The manhole cover had been one plan of escape, thought of in the spur of the moment. But I've found that I have one great strength. As a quirkless nobody, I'm pretty plain. So I set off that smoke cloud and employed the best worst feature in my kit, the quick change function. I designed the suit to be taken off easily and to fold up into a convenient school backpack. Arsène Lupin blends in with the crowd. He is the man on the street. So I escaped by being just one more panicking civilian, another face in the crowd. With my hair covered by my cloak, my voice and eyes disguised by my mask and visor, I was anonymous. And so I came back to my evil lair, TM, with a huge amount of hero support gear to cannibalize for parts and a huge public debut. I suppose this is the story of how I became the greatest supervillain of all time. Chapter endnotes. Mastermind has finished his debut. Next time, Mastermind thinks about revamping his look. Please comment on things that worked and things that did not. I want this to be better. Issue 3, Delving in the Underworld, Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Izuku checked over his costume and gear, frowning. Parts of the cloak and cape had been burnt away by the explosions that Kacchan had been throwing out left and right. The other pieces of the costume, the EMP glove, grappling line, and the freeze ray were all being recharged. Going to need to make improvements, not to mention that something's been bugging me all day. Izuku was situated in the evil lair, TM, basement. Most of it was occupied by the various pieces that he needed to make the numerous devices and armor work. The spoils of victory were in a secure safe, while the rest of the room was covered in assorted bits and pieces. There was a grinding lathe, as well as a veritable wall of computer screens, the supervillain computer. One screen was keeping an up-to-date account of the heroes of Musutafu and their patrol routes for easier dodging appropriate villainous encounters. Another screen was keeping track of various projects that Izuku had started. Yet another was displaying a spreadsheet of organizations that Izuku had been trying to track, and more were keeping track of the various pieces of tech that he had been using. Most of the basement was covered in various work tables with villainous plans set up, written in code. Izuku had set up a table for a future council of villainy, with a few spots reserved for some of his personal idols. Most of the rest of the room was filled with pieces of tech in different stages of completion. A whole shelf was dedicated to the old comics and movies of old, the works that showed how supervillains like Izuku had to do things. Sighing in frustration, Izuku shoved the remainder of the gear aside and flopped down onto the couch. Pulling out a comic book, he idly flicked through it, trying to loosen up and just relax. As he read through a story that he had read for 100 times, something in his mind went click, and he shot out of his seat, eyes sparkling. "I've got it!" Really, it had been obvious from the start. What was the point of a mastermind without minions of some kind? Izuku Midoriya knew that he would need more people to work with him in the future. He took another look at his costume, which was displayed on a mannequin that he had salvaged from the beach. He frowned. "I think I need to update the look too. To Dr. Doom. Not me enough." His head spun, trying to think of better alternatives. Maybe a suit? No, too Lex Luthor then. Maybe a bug mask? No, that would be too Skitter. He grunted in exasperation, running a hand through his fluffy green hair. I'll think of a look later. It's time to hit the beach again. Sure, it would have been nice to have a massive budget, but Izuku was working with barely anything. Most of his resources were recycled from the beach. It may seem like everything I created was just the product of some superintelligence quirk. It was not. I was inspired by those old villains and threw myself into support and tech development. When I won first prize over 2 kids with intelligence-boosting quirks, my mother and teachers decided that I needed to be checked again, and by better means than the old missing toe joint test. We went to specialist after specialist. We did blood tests, MRIs, CAT scans, quirk factor tests. All came up negative. I was truly quirkless. The intelligence quirk kids weren't happy. One of them actually tried to strangle me before being pulled off by Kachan. After that, the teachers gave them a lecture about strangling. Not because it was wrong, but because it would negatively affect their chances of being in a hero course if they did. With such lousy prospective heroes, it reinforced my desires to be the greatest supervillain of all time. So I studies hard, I worked hard. Most of my support gear took years of hard work to make. I watched those with intelligence quirks boast about how far above the human grade they were, only to run into the limitations of their quirks. They didn't work hard at this stuff like I did. I was bright for a child. I put in the work, the extra hours. They did not. Toshinori Yagi sighed. The number was on his phone, practically glaring at him. He steeled himself, then tapped the call button. Mirai. All Might? The words were clipped professional, and yet there was a lilt of happiness to it. Toshinori Yagi All Might sighed. I'm calling to ask about young Mirio, the one you recommended. A pause. I never thought you would see reason. Yagi grit his teeth. Yesterday I was confronted with my weakness. It still galled him, the fact that he could have stopped this villain if only he had the time. Not once, but twice. There was a villain, a different one. I was in no condition to catch him. He escaped both times. A villain escaped you? Yagi nodded. I was at my limit. I could have, if I had more time, I could have stopped his attack. His name was Mastermind. Robbed a support company. Then he paused. He saved somebody that I should have. Mastermind. Hold on. A tapping of keys, then, this Mastermind, the one whose cape stuck in a doorway. More tapping. Mirai's voice, serious and laser-focused. And then he saves this, Bakugo, and makes a speech declaring his crimes. The HPSC is quite interested in this matter and in the heroes it implicates, and he has become a minor symbol overnight. Toshinori Yagi nodded. I can see that, but there it was. Something that had been churning in his gut on the day. Something that had led him to not try and push his limits. The memory of a villain, panicking and flustered, giving him a handkerchief. The villain who had been stuck in a doorway, then tried to act like it hadn't happened. He cleared his throat, the blood receding for now. He was not like any other villain. In spite of his choices, there was somebody who, I can't help but think that, he was harmless. He robbed a support building in broad daylight. He shorted out their defenses and made off with a startling amount of support gear that is likely to go on the black market. He is not harmless. Mirai's voice cut like a scalpel. Toshinori frowned. It just didn't feel threatening in my gut. Now, you say that this Mirio would be a fitting successor? Another pause. How about I arrange a meeting? Let you make the final choice. All Might nodded. This whole ordeal made him feel like a teenager again. He knew that he would have to retire eventually, but having the reality of the situation shoved in his face was just humiliating. But he would meet this young Mirio with an open mind. Death Arms, Mount Lady, and Kamui Woods refused to look at each other while the small man from the Heroics Public Safety Commission glared over them. Let's get this straight. He patted a printout, a photo taken by a civilian on the scene of Mastermind reeling the boy in while the heroes were standing around. You didn't intervene in this hostage because of a threat to your life and, quote, not having the right quirk. Death Arms bit his lip. And as a result of this, a self-declared supervillain just takes center stage, saving the hostage and making a declaration like that? This man had a quirk that they knew was minor, yet all the heroes felt small and insignificant before his stare. We We were resolving the situation. Death Arms managed before he was pinned in place by a stare as sharp as a stake through the heart. Let me tell you something. The HPSC representative picked up a remote and turned on the screen behind him. The montage flew by. Mastermind at the support center. Mastermind glaring down the heroes. Mastermind saving the victim. This represents nothing more or less than a catastrophic failure on the part of the heroes. Professional heroes granted a license by us, standing around with their thumbs up their asses while a villain saves a hostage? He shook his head slightly. It doesn't look good for you. Not at all. Mount Lady shifted. The streets were too narrow. Then shrink and get a car, or plan ahead in future. He glared at her and she shrank back. He sighed. Frankly, this is disappointing. For two such bright prospects and an experienced pro to be less than useful in an incident like this, mopping up after a villain, it does not look good. He glared at each of the heroes. Any one of them could have reduced him to a fine pulp, but they quailed before his gaze. Now then, I believe you have more important matters to attend to. Don't let me detain you. He sat behind his desk, glancing up at them. You are dismissed. The door opened, and they left with the demeanors of sullen teenagers. Mount Lady and Kamui Woods avoided looking at each other. Death Arms started to turn to give the man a piece of his mind, then whipped back and stomped out with murder on his face. A few days later, Midoriya Izuku was a bit surprised to see a couple of figures on Musutafu Beach. From the looks of things, they had a skip at the ready. Maybe they were a volunteer group? Izuku knew that nobody really wanted to be here at the beach. He looked them over, assessing. One, tall and gaunt with corny yellow hair. Ah! He had seen that man before, the one coughing up blood. Izuku was just happy to see that he was all right. The other one was a teenager, a couple of years older than Izuku, maybe a second year in high school. And he was built like a miniature All Might, with a confidence and easy smile that Izuku honestly envied. He looked like a great hero already. Izuku looked between the two people. Blonde hair, blue eyes, confictance, ah! Izuku jogged over to them. Oh, hello. Both people whipped around to see him, the tall, skinny father, looking a bit out of sorts. Izuku didn't mind. He pointed to a battered television. Ah, are you doing a beach cleaning project? The son smiled. We sure are. I was talking with, ah! The bloody cough man looked askance, then made a short bow. Toshinori Yagi. Izuku's eyes sparked, and he wanted to slap himself. How could he have not recognized him? You're Toshinori Yagi, your All Might's secretary. Yagi seemed taken aback. You know me? Izuku scoffed. How could I not? The greatest All Might buffs know that there's a Toshinori Yagi in the Might Tower. His officially listed position is of All Might's secretary, but there's a bit more to your position. You help manage not just All Might's meetings with the police, but also with the media, the fashion designers. There's a forum dedicated to Toshinori Yagi sightings. The man looked bewildered and slightly put upon. People care that much about me? Izuku nodded, eyes beaming. Then he remembered himself. Ah! Please don't shut it down. We all appreciate all the hard work you put in for All Might, even if, just looking at your appearance, it seems like he doesn't appreciate it himself. Toshinori Yagi just stood there, stunned. Izuku turned to his son. My name's Izuku Midoriya. It's an honor to see a father-son bonding activity like this. At that, both parties stiffened in shock. Then came the inevitable. No, you have it wrong, young Midoriya. Yeah, we just look similar. He's not my dad. Izuku just remembered who this guy was. It was right in front of him, but he hadn't recognized the guy without what Izuku considered something memorable. You're the Pants Guy! Pants Guy blinked. Izuku got in full throttle. I just watched you last year. In the UA Sports Festival, you were the guy who kept phasing through your pants. You had an incredible performance. Izuku just knew that this guy was going to be a superhero. It's in the smile, the confidence, the aura. All he needed is an incredible villain to oppose him. Pants Guy blinked, then laughed. I can't blame you for temporarily forgetting my name like that. Well, the name's Togata Mirio, and when I'm a pro hero, the name's going to be Lemillion. Why? His expression turns hopeful, confident, because I plan to save 1 million people in my lifetime, at least. Izuku might be wrong. Of course, he knows that the majority of heroes needs a strong villain to challenge them and drive them to be plus ultra. But this guy was going to be a great hero without a nemesis. But if he needed one in the future, that's amazing, Mirio-san. He turned to the tech on the short. So you're going to be cleaning up this beach? At a nod, Izuku glanced at his hands. So, where's your gloves? There's a lot of sharp edges and rusty metal here. You could get tetanus. Toshinori started a little at that. And do you have a first aid kit in case on injury? Toshinori Yagi spluttered a bit. Well, his voice trailed off into nothing. Izuku sighed. You have to have a plan of action, otherwise you're going to suffer when things go wrong. He smiled at the both of them. But do you mind putting the electronics in a separate area? I'm using them for a school project. By recycling this stuff, I don't need to waste as much in terms of resources at school. Toshinori and Togata shared a look, and Izuku thought that they really were father and son. That false name was clearly a cover for Toshinori, before Togata turned to him with a smile like the sun. Not a problem. You'll collect it? Of course I will. A lot of people at school thought that since I was a major cape geek that I would be scrawny. That was true for a short while. But I needed supplies, and the beach had a surprising amount of stuff that needed recycling. So I dragged in a lot of stuff. Turns out that moving heavy weights was a good way to build muscle tone. I mean, I wasn't built like All Might, but I was a lot stronger than I looked. Still, it was pretty helpful to have Toshinori and Mirio put the mechanical stuff closer to where I needed it. It saved a bit of time in my daily routine. But while I was there at the beach that morning, I had a look at something that had been dumped there. An old dressmaker's dummy, similar to the model that I had at my evil lair. It was then that I got an idea. It was a brilliant idea that had been repeated in the pages of comic books for years, but it would require some serious funding. The business office was small and relatively cramped. Mastermind pushed the door open, striding in with confidence, cape fluttering behind him. A press of the button caused the cape to slump to normal levels before the door closed. Thus satisfied, the supervillains sat down opposite of the only reliable and decent contact they had had for the underworld. A man by the name of Jiran. The man sat across him. Well, this was a surprise. Mastermind wasn't concerned. Well, you should have known that the diabolical supervillain Mastermind, a crack of thunder, would come to a premier dealer in the underworld. Jiran stared for a second before chuckling. I suppose I should have. He leveled a stare across his desk at Mastermind. So what can I do for somebody who has made a relatively explosive debut? Mastermind sighed, rubbing the back of his head. Well, the truth of the matter is that I need some minions, people who believe in the same aims that I do. He looked Jiran in the eye. You struck me as the kind of guy who could find people like that. Everybody said that you were reliable, honest, more than most people out there. Jiran simply shrugged. If you have the money for it, I'll support damn near anything. He shrugged. Then again, most people aren't going to follow you. You're, well, he searched for words, coming up with eccentric. Mastermind shrugged. Mastermind cannot deny that, but could you help me find people who would work for me like that? Jiran just smiled, lighting a cigar with a flame from his revolver. I can try. What would be in it for me? Mastermind seemed to pause before he pulled out a small satchel. Support gear. Interested, Jiran leaned over to take a look at the items. An item was shaken loose, a piece of chest armor that popped out from what looked like a small canister. Tough enough to withstand one blow from All Might at full power, or so they estimated. Jiran sucked in a breath. That's mighty impressive. He reached for it only for Mastermind to pin him with a stare. He sighed. I'll put out feelers, get you recognized. There's bound to be some people crazy enough to work for you. Mastermind just beamed, or seemed to beam. Great. And if you can't find anyone, wire some money to your account of choice. What do you think I am? A corporation? I have a reputation for honesty, you know. After that exchange, and going into further detail about what he was looking for in his minions, Mastermind left the world of supervillains for the hellscape of middle school. Chapter endnotes. I'm trying to play this as reasonably cracky but plausible. Next time might be more action-packed, and we might get some fan-favorite characters. This feels good, though. I'm inspired by the Techno Queen and others, but also trying to make it reasonably credible. I'm trying to avoid Izuku just having an I win button and making him work for his victories. Criticize. Issue 4. The Bank Heist Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Bakugo Katsuki felt like he was going to explode. Aldera's school was shitty, with assholes who didn't even know him showing up with dumbass questions like, "How did you find that villain? What was it like to be rescued by that other villain?" And the teachers. Fuck the teachers. Always acting like he needed somebody to talk to. "My door is always open. If you want to talk about it, please keep me in mind." Fawning over him like that just made him sick. Bakugo didn't want to talk to any of those fuckers. He really didn't like the feelings that remembering the experience bring up. The choking, the helplessness. He is not, and never has been helpless. He's never needed help from anybody. Needing help makes him useless. Weak. If that's what being Deku was like, he wants none of it. Doesn't want his greatness to be dismissed and thrown away just because he needed help. Really doesn't want to be treated as lesser and made of glass for some bullshit involving bad circumstances that prevent people from seeing his potential. Bakugo was ever so slightly pissed off that teachers tended to say that Deku was smart in spite of being quirkless. Bakugo would never admit it, but Deku did do consistently better in a wide variety of subjects than him. It kept him on his toes, trying to outsmart the nerd. Not that he cared about Deku or anything. And the fucking irony of the situation was, Izuku Deku didn't do that stupid fucking thing that he did all those years ago. He's not there treating him like a baby and asking him if he needs help. Oh, sure, if there's some discussion he looks sympathetic, the little fucker. But otherwise, he hasn't brought it up independently. That hurt for some reason. Bakugo scowled. Well, if the nerd doesn't want to fucking do that dumb thing where he reaches out and gives him a hand that is unnecessary and unwanted, then he'll leave him alone. About time that the nerd realized that Bakugo Katsuki isn't so weak as to need a hand, even though he will never admit it to anybody, but he wouldn't mind one. Deku just kept tinkering at his desk, the damn nerd. When he looked up as Bakugo slammed down into the seat in front of him, Bakugo just knew that the damn nerd was smiling for some fucking reason. But he hasn't mentioned that fucking slime villain, so Bakugo guesses it's alright. Kachan's my best friend. No, really, he is. Even if he'll never say it, I know Kachan. I think that with a great villain, he's going to be the best, and that supervillain is going to be me. I have to admit, Kachan's, well, explosive. He's rude and arrogant, and he treats others pretty badly. There's a lot of things that I dislike about him, almost hate, but at the same time, when I see him in my mind, I can't help but think of victory. Think of those times that he beat up those kids who were a couple of years older than us, and then grinned like it was nothing. I see Kachan pushing himself harder and harder to get those skills that others say are natural talent down to that level. I see him smiling and confidently leading other kids around like hits natural, glaring down teachers and older kids alike with no fear. I can see the slight hurt in his eyes whenever the teachers and other kids praise his quirk, his grades, everything but him. Never noticing the hard work and just saying that he's gifted. I can see him try to express how much he respects somebody else by going, "You're not just a shitty extra," and not being able to find different words for it. I want to say that I saw him on that day and that he needed help back then, and I gave it, but that would give the game away of my identity. Then Kachan will kill me, and then I'll be arrested. Man, being a supervillain is almost as tough as being a superhero. Cafe was an ideal spot for Midoriya Izuku to get a little bit of extra money from a summer job. It's also, conveniently, near the building that he was scoping out for his next villainous act. It is a high-class cafe with a strict dress policy for its servers. It's this dress policy that made Mastermind realize something that would give him the necessary look. The source of inspiration was at hand. This is it. This is what I was looking for without even realizing it. He checked himself in the locker room mirror. Black slacks leading down to a pair of well-shone black loafers. A white shirt with a black tie, with a black sleeveless vest over it, neatly buttoned up. Looking at himself in the mirror, Izuku felt like he did when he built his first piece of support equipment. He checked the pockets, spinning a little. For some reason, this just feels right. Like was meant to be. Midoriya Izuku was shaken out of his reverie by the manager coming in. "All right, kid, let's go." He looked at Izuku's throat. "How the hell did you do that with your tie?" The tie was short, fat, and stubby, which seemed impossible considering that the tie had been a skinny one. Izuku winced. "Sorry, it's just how my dad always did up his tie, and he showed me how to do it." His manager sighed. "How you can fool around with the coffee machine like you were born to improve it, but can't tie your tie properly is beyond me." He gestures. "I'll help you do it this once. I hate to say it, but you might need a clip-on, but only because I can't see how you'd mess a clip-on up." Izuku nodded, blushing. His tie wasn't that bad, right? After his tie had been fixed up, Izuku worked hard for the rest of the day. Idly, he noticed what looked like a father and daughter pair also checking out the bank. The older man asked for some pretty expensive tea while his daughter asked for a straight black coffee. "Okay, we'll be right back." The father and daughter nodded, the man thanking him and wishing him well. Something about the man seemed familiar, but Izuku couldn't place it. Well, it was sure to come back to him. It had been a long day after school and his summer job. Deep in the evil lair, TM, Izuku Midoriya checked over his latest project. "Yes," he breathed. It had taken a while to assemble the components, but it was all ready. The mannequin had given him an idea. Sure, he knew that he'd need other people to pull off bigger jobs, but what if he had some extra help? More specifically, if he had a fake body, rigged to do his evil bidding. Like Dr. Doom, a devilish body double so that he could never be caught. As a last resort, he could destroy it, leaving no trace back to him. After hours of work, he had completed one of his most demanding projects so far. It stood in front of him, waiting to be powered on. A mannequin's body housing a variety of electronics, outfitted in a copy of his newest villain look. Underneath the costume, there were powerful industrial-strength servos designed to mimic human movement as much as possible. In Izuku's hands was the remote control for the unit, along with a microphone for speaking through it. What? Izuku had to go to school, got most of his components from the beach or his underfunded public school, and had a budget that was nanofiber thin even with his stash of looted support gear. Developing an AI that not only could pass a Turing test, but could Turing test itself was just not feasible, so a remote-controlled body would have to do. Yes, he gripped his thunder machine. Yes! Thunder rolled once more. It's finally ready. The diabolical electronic kick-ass unit is ready. He pressed the power button, confidently. The robot in front of him shuddered to life, lights flicking on, and then the arms shot off. One leg collapsed, dumping the whole body on the ground, and the other leg flailed around in ways no human leg should. Then it caught fire. Izuku sighed, grabbing the fire extinguisher. Well, that's Beta 1 of the Deku. Really wanted it to work, but I've just found how not to build an android replica of myself. Obvious faults in the limbs and power cell, as well as general structure. Spraying it down, he turned around. But my newest outfit and gadgets, on the other hand. He pressed the thunder machine just for dramatic effect. The heroes won't know what's coming. Mwah! The door above banged, and Izuku's secret security camera picked up his mother at the basement door. "Izuku, it's time for dinner." Izuku's head whipped around. "Okay, thanks, Mom. What are we having?" His mother just smiled. "We're having curry rice." Izuku sniffed. "Smells great, Mom." He bounded up the stairs, turning off the lights. As he went up, various shutters and organizational bits and pieces folded up and came down, protecting vulnerable pieces of tech and plans from his mother's eyes. Supervillainy would have to wait until tomorrow. My mom, she's the best as well. When I didn't have my quirk and I asked her that question of if I could be a hero, she broke down. It wasn't the answer to the question that I wanted then. But after self-reflection and changing my goal, I started on improving my science and technology knowledge. After all, I wanted to be a supervillain, or support hero, as I told my mom. Even back then, I knew that people didn't just admit that they wanted to be supervillains. That's just silly. Mom was a bit worried at first, seeing me just go for tech and science like I had. She thought that there was something wrong with me, that I was denying something about myself. Mom wasn't sure what to do with my tech interest. She did some looking up of stuff. She bought me some junior science kits, helped get me involved with some clubs. She got me a little lab coat and watched me do experiments and asked me questions about what I was doing. Some small exasperation and worry soon turned to wonder and then pride. When I nearly got choked out by one of those intelligence quirk kids, she'd taught them and their parents a real lesson. I didn't hear what she said, but apparently the other kid and her parents had to sleep with the lights on after that. Then they moved to a nearby prefecture. I really didn't want to have to deal with them, and my mom didn't want me talking about them, so we moved on. Sure, we've had times where we've driven each other mad, but ultimately, we love each other. My mom's just so happy that I'm doing what I love. She signed up with Bakugo's mom for this gym place and has a ton of friends there. Sure, she still worries about my dad, and I know that she worries about me and all of the explosions and fire in the basement. But she's so proud of what I've done with myself, and knowing all of this, it's just, I love my mom so much. The only person who comes close to how much I love my mom is All Might, and if anybody did anything to my mom, I would be forced to kill everybody involved and then myself. That's just a joke. That's just a joke. Kinzara Bank was fairly reputable. It was a small local bank that had branches in Musutafu and a couple of other prefectures. The service was decent and they were fairly generous. But Gentle Criminal knew better. He had done his own research into the bank and he found the bank disgusting. The bank had a rather nasty loan shark business operating. It was almost like a protection racket with how they pressured businesses under them. How very ungentlemanly. Is the camera rolling, La Brava? Gentle Criminal was here. Gentle Criminal was here, and he was already doing a job. Izuku was seeing Gentle pull a bank robbing job live. Izuku could get involved with Gentle Criminal pulling a job. Stay calm, Izuku. Introduce yourself in a cool way. Izuku opened his mouth and let out a manly shriek. Oh, Migosho, 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 you're Gentle Criminal. Now everybody around them was looking at him in a confused and scared way, not sure whether to run or keep watching. He didn't care, continuing to ramble. Oh, wow, just wow. Izuku went forwards, already pulling out a pad of paper from his utility belt. I'm your biggest fan. Please, could you sign this, please? Gentle Criminal stood there, blinking, with an expression similar to a stunned fish. At those words, he started, then looked at Izuku with wide eyes. You're my biggest fan? Izuku nodded, pen in hand. Yes, I subscribe to your channel every time it gets taken down. I have a bot that tracks for it and then auto-subscribes me. It's... Izuku paused, pressing a button on the side of his visor. A small pump sluiced away the tears that were building up, pouring it into the coolant section of his gear. This is one signature that I've always wanted, ever since I heard of you. He took a deep bow, pad presented with both hands firmly gripping the corners. Gentle Criminal took the pad, stared at it. Then, he got back the familiar look in his eyes, the look of a gentleman rogue. With a flourish, Izuku now had Gentle Criminal's signature, and it was made out to Mastermind. It said, to my biggest fan. Now all Izuku had to do was get All Might's signature and he would have 2 great family heirlooms. Gentle Criminal coughed. It's always a pleasure to have a dedicated fan. Now, where were we? Izuku blinked. Ah, yes, that's right. He leaned over the counter. Could you give both of us a large sum of money, please? I need it for my villainous schemes. He placed a large bag with the yen symbol prominently picked out in green ink. Gentle Criminal nodded, passing over his own briefcase. Quickly now, before the heroes get here. The teller shook. You're going viral on HeroTube, both of you. His hands shook as he started scooping money in slowly. Halt, villains! Some heroes had arrived, 3 of them. One of them in a more mechanical suit, another in a more traditional yellow and red spandex suit, and the last in what looked like a business suit with a fedora and domino mask. The hero in the spandex pointed a finger. Drop your weapons and surrender. Gentle turned around. Ah, it's the heroes. He turned to Mastermind, voice lowered. Tell me, have you wondered how I get out of these situations, Mastermind? Izuku just nodded, eyes sparkling. Gentle Criminal gave him a wink. It's going to be our secret. He whipped around, stance confident. Ha! You think a mere 3 heroes will give me much trouble? A few more heroes rounded the corner and readied themselves. Gentle Criminal stared for a bit. He tapped the earpiece he had. La Brava. Mastermind sensors picked up a "You got it, Gentle," and then something got mumbled before Gentle seemed to glow with power. Quickly, Mastermind focused on getting the money into his large sack and the briefcase. Gentle cracked his neck. I hate to do things in such an ungentlemanly fashion, but it cannot be helped. And then he moved. The hero in the business suit reached out and threw a pair of handcuffs that stretched and took a life of their own, only for them to get stuck in the air in front of Gentle. What? The air then bounced back, sending the handcuffs right into their owner's face. Gentle winced a bit, finishing the attack by firmly jabbing his cane into the hero and knocking the wind out of him. Gentle seemed undaunted and confident in this, but most importantly, he was not alone. Smoke surrounded the pair of them, cutting off the view from the other patrons as Mastermind leapt into the fray. One of the heroes went for Mastermind, hands sparking with electricity. Mastermind ducked his thrust and slammed the briefcase into the man's chin, sending him spiraling down. The next hero to attack, a woman in a red and black costume, stretched an arm out an impossible distance, trying to punch him in the face. Narrowly dodging, he clamped his left hand on hers. Electricity sparked, causing her to scream before Mastermind closed the distance to sock her again. The man in red and yellow took in a deep breath. Flickers of flame came around his mouth. Gentle went to gesture, but Mastermind pulled out his small freeze ray. As the hero breathed fire at the pair of them, Mastermind fired a blue-white beam back. The resultant temperature clash caused a minor explosion, sending the hero stumbling back and Gentle taking the initiative, springing off the air to deliver a blow to the gut that folded the hero like a piece of paper. The other heroes glanced between each other. A plan seemed to form for the remaining heroes, and they stood their ground, powers at the ready. Gentle and Mastermind shared their own look, then leapt back into the fray. The civilians watched with bated breath. Sure, these villains were powerful, but the heroes, they would win for sure, wouldn't they? They had to. Gentle Criminal and loyal subscriber team up, Kinzara Bank heist. The video itself had started with Gentle Criminal explaining his motives for robbing the bank. There had been what looked like security camera footage, gathered by loyal fans like you, showing the owner of the bank, a man with a shark mutation, threatening various business owners. One of them had had their head shoved into his mouth as his accountant made points about not paying your dues. Then the video cut to the events of the bank robbery and an unintentional team-up of bank robbers. The villains took a deep breath, composing themselves. And that's a wrap. On the screen, Gentle Criminal and Mastermind took their bow. Behind them, the Kinzara Bank had been deformed slightly, wobbling in place as if it was made of rubber. Around them, the groaning bodies of heroes, unconscious and in various positions. One of the heroes had been tied up with what looked like the hero's own handcuffs. The civilians in the hall were all unharmed, but were running away from the scene with nervous and terrified expressions on their faces. Mastermind seemed to grin, holding up both his sack of money and the briefcase. Here you go, Gentle. Always a pleasure to help out a fellow supervillain. Gentle accepted it with a warm smile on his face. And thank you, Mastermind, for your help today. Mastermind nodded, then started. He pulled something out of his pocket. I think you might find this helpful for your video if you didn't already know about it. He then turned to the camera. Never thought I'd do this. Midoriya! Be afraid, heroes, for the brilliant Mastermind has struck again. Better luck next time. And with that last statement, the villain sprung away. Gentle Criminal looked in his direction where he'd left with a fond smile before turning back to the camera. If you want to support my villainy, then I want you to click that like button in a gentlemanly or ladylike fashion, subscribe, and click the bell for alerts. And don't forget to leave a comment, and I will see you. With the police sirens coming, Gentle Criminal pulled out a small black device. In the next video, Gentle Criminal away. And with that, he threw the object on the ground, covering the area in thick purple smoke. When it cleared, He was long gone, and the video ended. A furry hand closed the laptop down, the other hand pouring a cup of tea. A furry snout sniffed the tea, eyes closing in pleasure. My. The figure sitting in front of the laptop took a sip of tea. A brilliant villain like that, taking such center stage, how very interesting. Principal Nedzu gave a little grin. Technical skill, intelligence, imagination, decisiveness. Oh, I can't wait to pull you apart and see what makes you tick. The small grin on his face turned into something more feral, teeth exposed and pupils shrinking. He started to giggle, then chuckle. His grip on his teacup started to get shaky, and droplets of tea started to spill everywhere as his laughter intensified. It's been so long since I've had a challenge like you. Ah! Ah! Chapter endnotes. Well, we have updated. In this thrilling issue, Bakugo gets some character development. Izuku discovers his look, and we meet with Gentle Criminal and La Brava. What happened next? Issue 5, Partners in Crime chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Izuku squinted inside the bowels of the dummy. Change over a few wires, alter the power cell, reinforce the servos again. He sighed a bit at that. Building support tech in general and villain tech specifically was hard work. Making even a crude mimic of his body took a considerable amount of skill. Sure, Izuku was skilled, but there were limits to what you could do. Most of his money had just gone to getting better tools, more advanced electronics. After being satisfied that it all worked, that everything was in order, he clicked the panel shut, screwing it back together. All right, the Deku unit, take 5. He pressed the power button on his remote control. The machine whirred to life, internal gears grinding. A light turned on in its eyes, and then it shut down again, slumping. Izuku pumped a fist. Yes, it didn't explode. Progress. He wiped his hands clean with a rag, now to get it to actually move around. As Izuku started checking the structure and wiring of his robot again, maybe some soft parts would help around the joints, he heard his villain phone go off. Without turning around, he shouted, "Speaker!" and continued working on the insides of the robot. "Oh, hello, Mastermind. How have you been on this fine day?" Izuku stopped everything. "Gentle Criminal?" He rushed over to the mouthpiece, strapping it on. "How did you find me?" There was a soft chuckle on the other end. "Well, after the success of my last video, I actually got in contact with some people in the underworld. I had to see if I could track you down, and luckily, I found Jiran, who was asking around for people to follow you." Izuku smiled a bit as Gentle continued. "I talked with him and asked him if he had any way to contact you. Fortunately, he gave me this number on the explicit promise that I don't tell anybody else." Jiran said that? I guess he really does deserve his high reputation. He really does. Now, I was wondering if you would like to, well, team up in the future. For Izuku, time had stopped. The only thing that could have made his day even more than this would have been All Might himself showing up, declaring him the #1 All Might fan of all time and autographing everything he owned. He stood in the middle of the basement, mouth agape and shaking slightly. "Mastermind?" "Yes!" Izuku shouted, then coughed. I mean, yes, I would love to." "Splendid. Then let us meet at Jiran's office in a few minutes. I can give you directions to the abode of La Brava, and I there." Izuku managed to strangle a squeal of pure happiness. Gentle Criminal felt slightly awkward, sitting there in the small office. La Brava stood next to him, idly checking on her phone regarding the account they had created for his villainous efforts. Gentle cleared his throat. "Are you sure he said he was coming? It's nearly our appointed meeting time." In the desk opposite, Jiran simply smirked. "I know my clients. He'll come through in 3, 2, 1. Wham! The door was thrown open, and Mastermind strode in, a crack of thunder coming as he did so. "Greetings, Jiran-san. Mastermind is here. And greetings to you as well, Gentle-sama, La Brava-san." He gave a deep bow to each of them, then sat down in the chair left for him. Jiran smiled. "Well, it's good to see a figure like you." He chuckled lowly. "Having somebody like you show up means more business for me. More people seeing the benefits of good support gear." Mastermind nodded. "Well, I'm glad to hear it." He leaned forwards in his chair. "So, you've been doing well, Gentle-sama?" Gentle just laughed, holding a hand up. "Please, just Gentle would be fine." His smile widened. "As for how I've been doing, the channel's doing incredibly well." "Yeah, La Brava piped up, holding her phone out. We've gotten positive comments this time, and people are actually subscribing and taking us seriously. She shot Mastermind a look of gratitude, which the self-proclaimed supervillain seemed to blush and start to flail. Gentle just waved it off with an easy smile. And it's all thanks to you, Mastermind. Mastermind spluttered, finger pointing at himself. Me? I had been doing my own investigation on that bank, and what I found was bad. But I didn't go so far as to have recording devices set up to capture illegal acts like that. Gentle bowed, which had Mastermind stammer and fumble over his words to get him to stand up. Please, Gentle. No, the praise is yours, Gentle Criminal replied. You went above and beyond with that, and as a result, I have to admit, for all I inspired you, I know that working alongside you I could be greater. Gentle, it's okay. La Brava tried to reassure him, with Mastermind repeating her assurances. Gentle just shook his head. That's why La Brava and I wanted to work together with you. As partners, definitely. He grinned. I've been in this business for longer than you have, and I can teach you some things yet. Mastermind sat there, seemingly unsure of what to say. Then he shook himself, regained his composure. If you, the brilliant villain Gentle Criminal, want to work with me, the supervillain Mastermind, as a partner, how can I say no? Thunder roared in the small office. Mabwe, ha! Together, we'll shake the world of heroes to its core. Ha! There was the sound of clapping behind him. Magnificent. Truly magnificent. Mastermind and Gentle Criminal spun around to see the new figure in the doorway. Wearing a black waistcoat and slacks with an orange shirt, blank white mask with a grin etched on it with a top hat, the tall man behind them continued clapping before taking a bow. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in the flesh. I have to admit, my mind was halfway made up when Guran gave me a call about your situation, Mastermind. Mastermind spluttered a bit. Well, what? The tall man started. Oh, I haven't introduced myself properly. He pulled a pair of small marbles out from his pocket and tossed them in front of him. A pair of floodlights sprang into existence, casting him into shadow. I am known as Mr. Compress, magician, villain, showman. He took another bow, arms sweeping into a dignified position. And for the purpose of this conversation, interested in working under a villain like you. Mastermind stared blankly. Huh? Mr. Compress chuckled. Your presentation is pretty good for an amateur, which is most of the reason I am here. I chose you over others because you've got a different look to you than other villains. You have a sincere belief that you can change things. His tone of voice changed, becoming more serious. You want to change the world of heroes in your own way, odd in somebody as young as you are. Mastermind seemed to still. Gentle looked at the man next to him, watched his fist clench. I do. Whatever he'd been thinking about seemed to clear, and he perked right back up. If you wish to be the first of my dastardly minions. Minions? Then we can start our works right away. With all of us working together, he started to chuckle, hand gripping his tiny device. The world of heroes will never know what hit it. Mwah! Mwah! Toshinori Yagi nodded approvingly at Mirio. You're doing an excellent job, he remarked, his successor beaming up at him. Togata Mirio's schedule was pretty busy. As well as schoolwork, he also had to continue his internship with Sir Night Eye's hero agency. Coming here to the beach helped give him additional breaks as well as train his body to handle One for All. Toshinori approved of the boy's drive, and he could see that the boy's easy smile and confidence would mark him as a future symbol of peace. So why did he feel so uneasy about passing the quirk to him? Come on, Toshi, listen to me. Do not pass One for All to him. Is anything getting through your successor's thick head, Seven? He was always stubborn like this. We have to keep trying. One for All will kill that boy, and he won't even know why. Come on, Yagi. Listen to our voices. Try harder, dude. Yagi grunted, hand clasped to his head and the copper tang of blood in his mouth. He was getting a lot more headaches lately, and his scar had been aching like mad. He didn't know why. Maybe it was getting close to the anniversary of his master's death. That always made his scar ache. Mirio looked at him with concern. Are you all right, all Yagi-sensei? Yagi just sighed, rubbing his temples with a pained smile. A bit of a headache, young Mirio. Nothing more. Mirio looked like he wanted to say more, but then returned to the work at the beach. We were so close. Damn it! Let's tie a different tack. Keep going for the gut instinct. Odd to hear you like this, too. Please. I think the man and his apprentice are insufferably naive and overblown. It doesn't mean that I want the kid to die young. That, and I don't want to hear Eight's whining. Yagi winced. He really needed to talk with somebody about these headaches. That, and sometimes he'd had dreams where his master had been trying to talk to him, only he couldn't hear her voice, only a few muffled words. It was as if she was talking in the next room over. Then the usual nightmares started, and it all got worse. Maybe he needed to take that therapy Hound Dog had been talking about after all. He may have landed a deadly blow on my brother, but he barely received the first vision we gave to him. We'll have to keep trying. Say, Ayagi-sensei, I was kind of curious about one thing, Mirio said, starting on hauling a fridge across the sand towards the designated tipping point. Yes? Well, you said that this was a power passed down through the generations, right? Yagi nodded, mind going to what he thought was coming. It seemed like his headache had let up a bit at those words. Right. There were 7 users before me. With this training, you should be ready to be the 9th. Mirio nodded, shoving the fridge further up the beach. Young Midoriya was standing there with his own parts, encouraging young Mirio to come to him. Yagi wasn't sure what the other young man was building. He could see some wheels, various electronics, what looked like most of a car, and other pieces that he couldn't identify. Mirio was able to push it quite far before he needed a breather and to get his thoughts in order. So I was curious about the past bearers of One for All. What were they like? Investigate, Toshi. Come on, investigate. This is the right thing to do. Look us up. Look me up for that matter. It can't be that hard, right? Stop being a naive, muscle-brained idiot and listen to us for once. Toshinori Yagi blinked, then smiled. Well, I can't see the harm in knowing more about the past bearers. Oh, thank God. Toshinori winced. Yeah, it would be a good idea to look up the predecessors. He'd been a bit curious about the matter itself, and it seemed that thinking about those who came before him had cleared up his headache. Could it be a sign from One for All, those past generations encouraging him on this path? Probably just a coincidence that it cleared up. He'd still do the research, though. It might be helpful for young Mirio to learn about the predecessors. See how they handled One for All with their different quirks. Then he'd have to see about getting some Panadol. These headaches had been getting more intense lately. How can somebody this smart be so dumb? Some days after Mastermind had been on the beach, and he'd received a call from Jiran. It turned out that Mr. Compress wasn't the only one who'd answered Jiran's call about being a henchman under Mastermind. Honestly, Mastermind hadn't expected to have so many people go along with his cheerful little job ad he'd had Jiran pass around. He looked at the job advert in his hand again. For those who wish to aid an up-and-coming supervillain oppose the heroes and pursue supervillainy, please apply at Jiran's or my number. Not interested in people who want to hurt others for fun. He had vaguely hoped that people would respond to his advert, but here they were in the rather dirty bar that Jiran had set up as a meeting spot. There were a couple of other people there who actually wanted to help him. It was a bit of a new feeling to have other people who shared at least part of his vision. So, my name's Mastermind. I'm pleased to meet you. He bowed, quickly and deeply, then straightened up. The first person to answer did so with a giggle, white-gloved hand coming up to her mouth. She vaguely resembled a cat, with sharp pointy ears at the top of her head and a distinctly feline muzzle. Her body was covered in an ink-black fur that contrasted sharply with her paper-white muzzle. A thick mound of hair, the same shade as her body curler around her head. Mastermind was pretty sure she was wearing a bodysuit as dark as the rest of her, with a long red jacket thrown over it, along with white sneakers. Otherwise, she'd shown up naked. And considering how curvy she was, that would be pretty embarrassing for him. No, she was wearing a bodysuit. He was sure of that. Pleasure's all ours. She gave a wide grin, thrusting out a hand. You're a bit shorter in person than I thought you would be. Since I guess we're going by villain names, call me Inkblot. Nice to meet somebody as polite as you. The second man gave a wide grin. That was about the only facial feature that Mastermind could make out from beneath the nearly head-covering black mask the man wore. His skin was tinted a shimmering gold, which made his teeth stand out amidst the near-blinding color. He was wearing a yellow pinstripe suit, slightly oversized, dirty, and rumpled. As for the rest of him, he was slightly taller than Mastermind. "Call me Golden Grin. You're aiming to mess with the heroes? I can get behind that." He kept his hands shoved in his pockets. "Honestly, I came because I half thought it was a joke." The third looked like a wreck of a man who hadn't really slept well. He was disheveled and unkempt, with what looked like surgical swabs under a brown overcoat on for a costume. Like him, they were stained and worn. He was skinny and pale, with long, delicate fingers like a pianist. A light blue disposable face mask covered his face, his matted black hair swept back into a messy ponytail. But I liked the bit in your advert about not hurting people for fun. He stank of whiskey and cheap cigarettes, but his purple eyes were sharp. "Is that true?" Mastermind nodded. "Absolutely." He leaned forwards. "I'm not doing this because I want to hurt people. I'm a supervillain, not a monster." The others traded looks. Most people would argue that a supervillain, by definition, hurts people. Golden Grin pointed out. Mastermind shook his head. "No, that's a villain. I'm a supervillain, and hurting people is not what I'm interested in." He shot out of his seat and began pacing. "Sure, I won't deny that I've had to fight people, but I, Mastermind," Thunder roared, causing everybody else to jump slightly, "am not some petty villain running around using their abilities to hurt other people. I am pursuing supervillainy to shake society at its core." The man seemed to weigh it up. "Well, you can call me Stitch. I'm a doctor for people who need it. I may have had my medical license revoked, but I still took the Hippocratic Oath." His eyes bored into Mastermind's like thermite through a steel door. "You try and get me to hurt other people, kid. I'm leaving." Mastermind tilted his head. "Why should I?" The other villains shared a look at each other. Golden Grin was the first to start talking. "This is weird. I mean, sure, I'm not a very experienced villain, but I get the feeling that this isn't exactly normal." "Yeah, usually the boss gets all grumpy and pushes people around if they aren't respected," opined Inkblot. Mastermind just laughed. "That's because they're villains. I'm a super villain." Mastermind looked over all the people who had assembled. "I'm guessing that you have some idea of what I typically do, yes?" Inkblot nodded rapidly, head a blur. "Sure do. You're a great ham. You just go in and use that crazy support gear to pull off your crimes. That, and you did that weird save, and you and Gentle must have gone like wham, bam!" Her arms flailed around as she spoke, with no regards to things like joints, and nearly hitting her fellow villains. "Yeah, you really showed those heroes, huh? You're pretty critical of them as well, aren't you?" Mastermind nodded. "I'm aiming to be a higher class of criminal. What the world needs is a supervillain to show those other villains how to do it, to give the heroes something proper that can remind them why they put on their spandex." He looked over each of them. "But I think you guys are still on the fence." Golden Grin shrugged. "I don't mind. You're messing with the heroes, and that's honestly hilarious." He gave Mastermind a slightly different look, appraising. "I suppose I should ask, what's in it for us?" Mastermind looked down at the ground. "I have to admit, I really can't pay you that much. I can offer support gear and some of the haul of any robbery we do, but that's all I can offer." He then shook himself, looking each of them in the eye. "This is a promise that I probably won't be able to back up. It's foolish." He stood there, stance confident. "But I can promise you that on any job that we pull, nobody gets left behind. And if you do go to jail, I will come for you and break you out." He actually took off his mouthpiece, revealing a small yet confident smile to each of them before replacing it. "Now, are you definitely going to join me in my nefarious pursuits?" The trio of villains looked at each other for a moment. Then they turned back to him. "Look, Mastermind," Inkblot started, sounding unusually solemn. "I've always loved acting, even worked in TV at one point. Getting to play the villain like this?" Her grin was surprisingly happy. "It's going to be great, so I'm definitely in." Golden Grin looked at him next. "I haven't been a villain for very long either. I just want to live my life without people getting on my case all the time, and I'm not really interested in fighting." A job like this, where I can just help you out with your schemes and not have to fight? A dream come true. Stitch was the last. Well, you're clearly either crazy or stupid, but I guess I can get behind a kid like you. Mastermind clapped his hands together. Splendid. Welcome aboard, my minions. I've had a great heist in the works for just such an occasion. How about you all meet me at this address? He handed out pieces of paper where he'd written out Gentle's flat, and I'll get the catering sorted to celebrate. They each took the cards, blinking. Inkblot was the first to speak. Okay, you are definitely not like the other villains. Is there going to be cake? Mastermind seemed to grin. Say no more, minions. Thunder roared yet again. Wah! Kamui Woods and Mount Lady had been helping some people around town when they heard their radios crackle with Death Arm's voice. Kamui Woods, Mount Lady, villain incoming. Who? Kamui Woods asked. What? Wooden limbs, thickening and stretching up to the roofs to get a better vantage point. Mount Lady continued go guide people out of the way, citing a potential villain capture. This just caused people to want to stay more, but most of them got the message and made themselves scarce. It's Mastermind. He's just broken into a store and made off with their product. Mount Lady frowned, scanning ahead and mapping the route ahead of her for when she had to intercept. What's he stolen? 40 cakes from that top-end bakery Bespin Cakes. Really expensive ones, too. Mount Lady just blinked. Eh? Why 40 cakes? Kamui Woods shook his head, keeping an eye out. That's what we don't know. For all we know, it's to power some evil device, or for some other scheme. Mount Lady shot into her giant form. Where's the villain heading? Coming your way down the main street. Be ready. Mount Lady and Kamui Woods traded a look, then charged off. Ahead of them, they could see sirens blaring as the police came through. With faces set in determination, they continued on. This villain had escaped them once. He would not escape them again. Kamui Woods leapt from rooftop to rooftop, while Mount Lady simply charged on ahead, the roads being cleared to allow the gigantification heroine to make her way through without incident. They came to a scene that was surprisingly tame compared to many other villain scenes. Death Arms was standing with the police barricade, face set in a grim scowl as he watched the villain approaching. Mastermind was driving a small car that was built in a similar fashion to a small ambulance, evidently where he was keeping his illegally acquired bounty. He'd painted it teal, with red hubcaps on the wheels. Ha! You'll never catch me like that, heroes? Death Arms scowled. Give up peacefully, Mastermind. Honestly, Kamui Woods grunted, wooden arms already starting to unfurl and ripple in preparation for his finishing move. Stealing 40 cakes? That's terrible. There's nowhere for you to run this time, Mount Lady shouted, keeping her stance wide in case she had to grab the car. Mastermind seemed to smile. That's certainly true. However, he seemed to reach down and push a button, and then his vehicle seemed to sink lower to the ground as he came closer and closer. You have forgotten something about me. The car came closer and closer to the barricade. Death Arms stood resolute and started spinning his arm in place. Electricity sparked along his arm and fist, building up a mightier and mightier charge. Kamui Woods built up more and more wood, watching the approaching vehicle. Mount Lady stood ready to try and pin him in place, a scowl on her face. Mastermind does not run, he escapes. The car sprang. It shot up and forwards like a rocket, slipping over the police barricade and between Kamui Woods' grasping branches. Mount Lady was just able to lunge to the side and grab it. No escape this time, Mastermind! Kamui Woods roared, branches already reshaping themselves. You're wanted for robbing a support company, breaking into a bank, using your quirk illegally, resisting arrest, and right now, attempted grand theft cake. Mount Lady glared down at the small figure in the vehicle, who gave her a little wave. Hello, Mount Lady. Sorry about this. Mount Lady and Kamui Woods traded a look, then charged off. Ahead of them, they could see sirens blaring as the police came through. With faces set in determination, they continued on. This villain had escaped them once. He would not escape them again. Kamui Woods leapt from rooftop to rooftop, while Mount Lady simply charged on ahead, the roads being cleared to allow the gigantification heroine to make her way through without incident. They came to a scene that was surprisingly tame compared to many other villain scenes. Death Arms was standing with the police barricade, face set in a grim scowl as he watched the villain approaching. Mastermind was driving a small car that was built in a similar fashion to a small ambulance, evidently where he was keeping his illegally acquired bounty. He'd painted it teal, with red hubcaps on the wheels. "Meba! You'll never catch me like that, heroes!" Death Arms scowled. "Give up peacefully, Mastermind." "Honestly," Kamui Woods grunted, wooden arms already starting to unfurl and ripple in preparation for his finishing move. "Stealing 40 cakes? That's terrible. There's nowhere for you to run this time." Mount Lady shouted, keeping her stance wide in case she had to grab the car. Mastermind seemed to smile. "That's certainly true. However, he seemed to reach down and push a button, and then his vehicle seemed to sink lower to the ground as he came closer and closer. "You have forgotten something about me." The car came closer and closer to the barricade. Death Arms stood resolute and started spinning his arm in place. Electricity sparked along his arm and fist, building up a mightier and mightier charge. Kamui Woods built up more and more wood, watching the approaching vehicle. Mount Lady stood ready to try and pin him in place, a scowl on her face. Mastermind does not run. He escapes. The car sprang. It shot up and forwards like a rocket, slipping over the police barricade and between Kamui Woods' grasping branches. Mount Lady was just able to lunge to the side and grab it. "No escape this time, Mastermind," Kamui Woods roared, branches already reshaping themselves. "You're wanted for robbing a support company, breaking into a bank, using your quirk illegally, resisting arrest, and right now, attempted grand theft cake." Mount Lady glared down at the small figure in the vehicle, who gave her a little wave. "Hello, Mount Lady. Sorry about this." Mount Lady looked at him, wary. "Sorry about what?" Mastermind slammed a hand onto the roof of the vehicle, and the whole thing suddenly sparked with electricity. She screamed as the electricity went through her, causing her to lose her grip on the small vehicle. It slammed onto the road, then tore off, weaving around Kamui Woods' branches. Mount Lady shrugged off the effects, and with a roar of anger started running after the fleeing vehicle, stopping briefly to grab Death Arms and carry him with her. Mastermind bobbed and weaved, heading towards a busier road. As he did so, smoke came out from the car, turning into a green smokescreen. "Oh, no you don't," Mount Lady snarled. Making a grand sweeping gesture, she started to clear the smoke from in front of them. A couple of cars went past, briefly blocking their view, but they were able to keep on his trail as he diverted from his original route and headed down a different street, maniacal robot laughter sounding along the way. Mount Lady's grin turned positively feral, and she picked up the pace. This was it. They had this little twerp. The way that Mastermind had been going, he would hit another police cordon. Traffic went away from the running giant woman with a hero in hand as the vehicle came to a stop in front of the police barrier. "There's nowhere to run, Mastermind," Death Arms hollered, as dignified as he could be with his position. "Come out with your hands." Mount Lady looked at the scene, adrenaline burning away, and then she saw it. "Oh no," she mumbled. Death Arms looked up at her with a confused expression. Shakily, she pointed at the vehicle they'd been chasing. "Looking at it properly, is it slightly transparent?" Mount Lady nodded, sinking to her knees with a dull expression on her face. In front of them, the image of the car flickered and faded, revealing a much smaller vehicle, only the size of a child's buggy with a massive block of holographic projectors on it. There were even a few small cameras and a radio, still blaring Mastermind's mocking laughter. Death Arms swore, the police already starting to fan out, and then the damn thing melted, leaving only a blackened sludge. They'd missed him. The car was inspired. I'd been practicing driving simulations, so then I came up with the idea for my own vehicle to carry greater heists. A few trips to the beach with the help of Yagi-san and Mirio-senpai, and I had my materials. It took a couple of days for everything to work and for me to be confident driving it, but that was all worthwhile. The holographic mini-vehicle, though, that really took a lot of effort to get it to work. And it didn't have to be perfect, just good enough. Rip out a few defunct Roomba brains, rig them up to cameras in a much smaller car, then tear out some defunct tech to make crude and rude holographic projection, and done. After that, the plan was simple. projecting a smoke screen behind you to make it look like you're getting away. Actually, deploy your decoy in a different direction and turn on the prototype cloaking device. Only good for a minute or two, but a minute is enough for the heroes to think they have you. Then, continue on your original path. Right here, to a drop-off point, Mastermind cackled. He pressed a few more buttons on his gauntlet, and the vehicle collapsed, revealing a couple of drones. A few more button presses, and they were in the air, disguises flickering to turn into 2 different transport drones. Very soon, there'd be major deliveries, and 2 drones would be missed in the chaos. The Mastermobile, as he called it, folded up further, taking on a smaller form. Now, to make my escape, there was a flicker of movement in one of the cameras of his hood. Right behind and above him, Mastermind turned and narrowly dodged the coiling gray scarf. The figure that was now in front of him, Mastermind recognized him. Black jumpsuit, black, scraggly hair, already standing on edge and waving in the air. A pair of yellow goggles and a coiling, scarf-like weapon in hand. "Playtime's over, villain," Eraserhead stated firmly, capture weapon coiled and ready to strike. Chapter End Notes. Chapter 5. Here we're introduced to Mastermind's villainous accomplices. And Eraserhead is cornering him. Who will win? Find out next time. Comment to keep me alive. Issue 6. S-Cake Chapter Notes. This fic is cracky yet plausible. Eraserhead is an extremely competent character with over a decade of experience and hand-to-hand combat skill against people who are far stronger and tougher. He won't lose to a teenager in body armor. Next time, Mastermind's villainous escapades truly begin. I need your comments to launch a comment bomb on Frieza. For Mastermind, the world seemed to stop briefly. Eraserhead had just come down, capture weapon in hand and obviously glaring at him. Furiously, he tried to think of a plan. Eraserhead didn't give him that opportunity. The Erasure hero pressed the advantage, throwing the capture weapon yet again, aiming for his center of mass. Mastermind narrowly dodged, trying to find a moment to breathe. Mastermind. More strands of capture tape sprang up and around Mastermind, only the cameras in his hood giving him any chance to dodge. He barely managed to roll out of the way as Eraserhead continued. It's completely irrational that an amateur like you has managed to get this far. A strand had snagged his arm. As he tried to think or remove it, he was suddenly pulled off balance, thrown to the side of the alleyway. More strands of the unique capture weapon came at Mastermind, forcing him to try running. From your 2 villain attacks previously, you've demonstrated considerable ability in planning your assault and for preparing when you have a moment to think. Your stealth and information gathering abilities are to be commended. Mastermind had to duck quickly as the capture weapon came at neck height. However, you don't seem to do so well when circumstances change. Your movements are sloppy, and you have numerous blind spots in your fighting expertise. Those pro heroes who practically gave you your victory on a silver platter should have never been given their licenses. Eraserhead swung closer, capture tape tightening on his arm, hair and the rest of the weapon floating in an unseen wind. You won't find me so easy to beat. You can't run, so give up and make it easier on yourself. Mastermind's head was spinning. This really illustrated why he needed minions. Here was the point where he knew that there were heroes and then there were pro-heroes. Eraserhead. How had he never thought about Eraserhead appearing? I can't run. This capture tape, Eraserhead, they're too quick, too skilled for me to beat him in a straight fight even with my armor. But if I don't escape, well, I'll be arrested. Worse, Mom will kill me. Think, Izuku. Think! What would Catch-on do? Eraserhead kept a wary eye on the villain, even as he prepared to wrap more tape around him. He knew full well that a cornered rat will bite all the harder. The important thing was to keep the bindings just loose enough that there was a chance at escape, until it was far too late for the villain to resist. He kept up the erasure effect as well. From what the villain had demonstrated regarding his devices, it wasn't a bad choice. That electrical attack then and with Mount Lady, it would make sense for an electrification quirk to be used to power this support gear. Nedzu had different theories, but both of them knew that you didn't take chances with some villains. He could test that theory later. Now he had to tighten the tape. Misrao. Eraserhead paused for a moment. There in the alleyway was a cat. A gray, short-haired cat with green eyes was watching them. As it saw Eraserhead turn his attention to it, it licked its paw and cleaned its ears. Eraserhead's grip slackened for just a second. What happened next? Eraserhead had to put down to an unexpected reaction. Villains who typically had their powerful quirk erased tended to panic. They got sloppy, made mistakes, and tried to get their abilities to work again. Or they froze in place, making them easy marks. He'd expected Mastermind to be the latter. The villain's prior behavior suggested that things not going to plan flustered them. Suddenly, the villain dashed forwards, arm cocked back slightly to wind up a punch. Eraserhead only hesitated for a moment. Die! But a moment was enough for the villain to slam his gauntleted fist into his face, aiming at his goggles. Eraserhead was able to roll with the punch, repositioning himself even as the villain tried to tear off the capture weapon. But his goggles had cracked. Not good. Mastermind took the opportunity to try and free himself from the capture weapon, taking advantage of the gap to start thinking. He's glaring at me, his hair's floating in the wind. He's using erasure. He must be trying to erase my quirk. The biggest things I've demonstrated have been my smoke screens, probably the freeze ray and taser glove. He must have assumed that one of them is my quirk. Mastermind's heads-up display beeped, detecting unusual energy signature. Analyzing. Estimated time for full analysis, 10 hours. Unusual energy? Erasure, maybe? I suppose that makes sense. But 10 hours? That's way too long. Mastermind took the opportunity to start priming the second support device he'd added to his costume. He'd been remiss about his boots. After all, some of the coolest gadgets needed to be attached to his legs to properly work. As he was working, though, Eraserhead managed to pick himself up, grip tightening on his support weapon. Mastermind watched him, warily. I got in a lucky shot. He won't fall for that trick again. Eraserhead shot forwards, and Mastermind blocked a blow to the face with his forearm. I've got one more trick up my sleeve. Analysis of energy, 9 hours, 59 minutes, 40 seconds. Thanks, Visor. Eraserhead's capture weapon readied itself to wrap around Mastermind again, but Mastermind was prepared. His free hand shot into his utility belt. As the binding tape came back, Izuku hip-fired his freeze ray at it, the beam of blue energy pushing the tape back and freezing it to the wall. Quickly, he shoved it back into his pocket, throwing a jab that the hero easily swayed around, the pro's elbow meeting his outstretched arm with a fierce blow that rattled Izuku badly. The pro hero spared a moment, reaching into the pouch on his back and pulling out a knife. Mastermind boggled as the pro just cut the frozen piece of the weapon off. Why the hell did the pro have a knife that could cut through carbon fibers like it was nothing? Shh! Mastermind barely twisted his head to the side to avoid the worst, as Eraserhead's fist flashed in lightning fast. He still heard the crunch of his visor being damaged, a large crack appearing on its view screen. The impact sent him spinning slightly into the nearby wall of the alleyway. Eraserhead followed it up with a kick to the chest that Mastermind swore actually dented his breastplate that pushed him into the wall. The pro hero himself seemed to have regretted that kick, wincing. That armor of yours is no joke. His eyes bored into Mastermind's own. So few villains. Mastermind pressed a button on his glove, then another. He was only going to have one shot, so he'd better make it count. Eraserhead whipped to the side at the sound of rotors coming behind him. One of the drones that Mastermind must have loaded up was barreling right towards him. Mastermind himself was reaching into that belt of his. What else did the villain have hidden in there? Eraserhead wasn't going to find out. The plan changed. As the drone came at him, Eraserhead jumped up and over the remains of his capture weapon, spiraling to try and loop around the drone womb. But as Eraserhead did that, he got hit in the gut with a grappling hook that came from the villain's other gauntlet. The blow was not enough to seriously damage, but it was enough to knock the wind out of him and disrupt his flow. The best he could do in the air was to haphazardly snag a fire escape with his tape and then turn a complete fall into a rather undignified tumble, but was at least on his feet. The grappling hook was retracted as quickly as it had come out. The villain took a gasp of air, then immediately took this time to run, cape billowing dramatically. Behind him, Eraserhead heard more rotors spinning. The other drone. Both of them were rising into the sky, and he could see their exteriors change to bulk haul Amazon drones. He was kicking himself for not bringing a tracker of some description. Holographic disguises. No wonder we haven't found this kid's stuff yet. He's shaping up to be one real problem villain, but he wouldn't be a problem if he got captured. Picking himself up and calling the air back into his lungs, Eraserhead charged once again, Erasure already taking its effect once again. The villain seemed to turn around and started fumbling with his cape. This villain may have been slippery, but he wasn't faster than Eraserhead, and he was soon right behind the villain. As I said, you have no hope of outrunning me. The villain didn't answer. Instead, he let the cape go, revealing that the hood was separate from the rest of the cloak. An attempt to protect his identity further? Before the cloak had gotten in the way, Eraser had seen the villain reaching for something in his belt of pouches, the same pocket where he'd been keeping that freezing support item. Eraserhead snorted at the crude ploy. Using the cape as a shield to peg me with that freeze ray? Futile. So Eraserhead dodged to the left, around the billowing cloak. Gotcha. Mastermind pressed the button for the cape's dramatic billowing function too. A wire so thin as to be almost invisible attached his masterpiece to the rest of the body. The cape, formerly billowing like a piece of cloth, needed a lot of extra gadgets inside it for it to dramatically billow. The whole thing was filled with wires in a similar fashion to Eraserhead's own gear. Not exactly. Apparently it was made of a special alloy with carbon fibers, and Izuku had only been able to get rather crude fabrics and electronics, but it was enough for it to be repurposed. Eraserhead grunted as the cloak suddenly wrapped itself around him, halting his advance and sending him skidding to the ground. The pro hero was struggling to get out of the cape. He must have gotten lucky that the knife was trapped. Mastermind knew it would take a while, and he would need all the time he could get, but he couldn't resist one last taunt. I'm sorry to put you in such a bind, Eraserhead. Just remember that this, with more bravado than Mastermind actually felt, was the day that you almost caught the brilliant supervillain, Mastermind. And with that, he ducked around the corner of the alleyway, intent on putting as much distance as he could between himself and the pro hero. A beep on his gauntlet, and the Master Mobile spun up, its smaller form heavier, but still a swift getaway vehicle. As it came towards him, he quickly jumped into the vehicle and took off. As he left, he looked at his hands. He was shaking, the adrenaline still pouring through his system. Mastermind grit his teeth. He'd been lucky up until now. He hadn't gone up against a hero that was good enough to pressure him. But Eraserhead, he'd shown him the world of pro heroes. Hell, he was counting himself lucky to have only lost his cape. A second later, and Eraserhead would have caught him again. How on earth can I be a suitable villain to All Might if I'm not good enough to beat Eraserhead? Gentle Criminal was worried. He checked his pocket watch yet again. Mastermind had said that he'd get cake and be back here by this time. Behind him, the other villains looked between each other. He said he would be back, Labrava spoke, looking down at her hands. Inkblot looked at her, giving her a gentle pat on the back. Well, I have to admit, for all that he's a complete newbie, he's managed pretty well so far. She looked at the door. Pretty sure he'll be here. The other villains shifted. Golden Grin managed to pipe up, leaning against the wall. Yeah, the guy's got guts, that's for sure. Mr. Compress simply shrugged. He's a near-complete amateur, but I really enjoyed the jobs that he's pulled. He seemed to grin. Pulling back the curtain on that support company, most villains would just take the gear and run, leaving behind those recordings of them cheating heroes. Brilliant. Gentle Criminal nodded. I couldn't agree more. I'm sure that he's just somebody who needs proper guidance. He was interrupted by the sound of rotors coming down, as well as a car drawing up outside. Rushing to the window, Gentle saw that Mastermind had arrived. The young man was looking battered and was missing his cape, but he was all right. He was accompanied by a pair of drones for bulk deliveries. Before he could properly wonder about them, their exteriors flickered and changed, revealing, "Is that cake?" Inkblot asked. He'd been lucky up until now. He hadn't gone up against a hero that was good enough to pressure him. But Eraserhead, He'd shown him the world of pro heroes. Hell, he was counting himself lucky to have only lost his cape. A second later, an Eraserhead would have caught him again. How on earth can I be a suitable villain to All Might if I'm not good enough to beat Eraserhead? Gentle Criminal was worried. He checked his pocket watch yet again. Mastermind had said that he'd get cake and be back here by this time. Behind him, the other villains looked between each other. He said he would be back, Labrava spoke, looking down at her hands. Inkblot looked at her, giving her a gentle pat on the back. Well, I have to admit, for all that he's a complete newbie, he's managed pretty well so far. She looked at the door. Pretty sure he'll be here. The other villains shifted. Golden Grin managed to pipe up, leaning against the wall. Yeah, the guy's got guts, that's for sure. Mr. Compress simply shrugged. He's a near-complete amateur, but I really enjoyed the jobs that he's pulled. He seemed to grin. Pulling back the curtain on that support company, most villains would just take the gear and run, leaving behind those recordings of them cheating heroes. Brilliant. Gentle Criminal nodded. I couldn't agree more. I'm sure that he's just somebody who needs proper guidance. He was interrupted by the sound of rotors coming down, as well as a car drawing up outside. Rushing to the window, Gentle saw that Mastermind had arrived. The young man was looking battered and was missing his cape, but he was all right. He was accompanied by a pair of drones for bulk deliveries. Before he could properly wonder about them, their exteriors flickered and changed, revealing, "Is that cake?" Inkblot asked. Indeed. Both drones were full of cakes, expensive-looking ones too. The villains looked back to Mastermind. Mastermind got out of the small buggy-like vehicle that had drawn up near the drone. 40 cakes, to be precise. Gentle shared a look with the rest of the group before he asked the question. Why 40? Mastermind looked down. Because it's terrible, he mumbled. Still, he started to come up to the house. Mastermind! Labrava came running down to meet him with a tackle hug that sent the taller villain sprawling. Don't worry us like that again? Okay, I won't? Mastermind managed to get out weakly. Yeah, it's pretty bad when your prospective boss gets arrested. Inkblot lightly punched Mastermind's upper arm. Makes a lady worried, you know? Mastermind just nodded. Again, I'm sorry for worrying you. I just wanted to do a nice surprise for you guys. Golden Grin flashed his nearly trademarked namesake. Okay, you've convinced me. First time in villainy that I actually get given cake. As Mastermind came up, Gentle went over to him. Are you sure you're all right? He murmured, taking in the scrapes, the crack in the visor, the lack of cape. Mastermind looked up at him. I'm fine. Just had a run-in with Eraserhead. Gentle and Labrava stilled. Stitch just shrugged. Even Inkblot's smile. Who? Who? Golden Grin asked. Inkblot just turned to him. You don't know Eraserhead? How on earth don't you know about him? I only started doing this shit 6 months ago. Come on. Stitch, surprisingly, was the one who answered. He's an underground hero, uses a quirk that erases the abilities of others along with some weird scarf weapon. One look and you're out. He shrugged. A lot of guys come to my clinic after that. They think that they've got a chance of losing their quirk permanently. Mastermind nodded. He was too fast, too strong. I barely got away. He glanced down at his feet. If there hadn't been a distraction, I probably wouldn't be here. Hearing Mastermind just relay that fact without his usual pomp was worrying for Gentle, and it was something that he knew he would have to acknowledge. Mastermind had managed to deal with some pros before, true, but that had been with Gentle covering for him and against heroes who weren't taking either of them fully seriously. Eraserhead? From what Gentle had seen, the hero was ruthless and sharp as attack. First time going against a real pro, wasn't it? Gentle's voice was calm, surprising himself. When Mastermind nodded, he sighed. You were able to get away, though. Next time you probably won't be so lucky. Mr. Compress nodded, looking surprisingly serious. I didn't think it would come so quickly, but thinking about this matter in the couple of days since I started associating with you, I came to a realization. Mastermind looked at him, and that was? Well, rather than be a minion, I was thinking of being a partner, maybe a tutor. At Mastermind's tilt of his head, he elaborated. You've made quite a splash in the month or so since you've started, but that just means that the heroes are gearing up as well. The nail that sticks out gets hammered down, Inkblot agreed. Reaching behind her back, she pulled out a hammer that was about her height with a head the size of a small trash can. See? Golden Grin started a bit. How did you write, Quirk? But yeah, even I've got more know-how than you, and I'm not old enough to drink. He then slapped his hands to his mouth. Gentle Criminal looked at him. Just how old are you again? That was a joke. I'm 30. Yeah. The other villains in Mastermind looked at him. He deflated. All right. I'm 16. Happy? Gentle patted Mastermind on the shoulder. What we're trying to say is, well, you said that you would help us, right? So we'll help you back, as partners. Mastermind just stammered, seemingly not able to process what was happening. I'm very grateful. Thank you. He bowed deeply to each of them. Inkblot grinned. You're a polite young man, aren't ya? Wish I could get a date like you. Her arms snaked around Mastermind's head and pulled him in, ignoring his stammers and red visor starting to glow an even brighter shade. We've got cake to eat, so let's get on it. Well, the day had gone mostly as I had expected it to. I had just my first brush with a pro hero, and had barely managed to scrape an escape. But coming back with the cake, getting people worried, that was all right. And well, I have to admit that it was nice for the other villains to want to help out a silly villain like me. Most of that first meeting over cake had been me recounting how I'd escaped, as well as the various tools I used for my own investigations. Meeting everybody here, eating well-earned cake, it felt pretty nice. I had other, friends is a bit of a strong word for it at my clubs. Pals, we shared the same interests, robotics, drama, and we got along for the most part. But dealing with people like this, even in a mask, it's surprisingly nice. I suppose we haven't really introduced ourselves fully, Mastermind said around mouthful of rather nice cake. He'd had to take off the lower half of his visor to fully appreciate it. He was just lucky he'd remembered to position his mask over his freckles. They were at least reasonably distinctive. Mr. Compress nodded. We're going to be working together, aren't we? Beyond names, we're going to need to know each other's quirks. He took center stage of the room. The name's Mr. Compress. My quirk is called compression. It allows me to take things both living and unliving. He demonstrated by taking his plate and then spinning it on his hand, instantly shrinking it into a small marble and back, and compressed them for easy transport and storage. Mastermind just gazed at it with figurative stars in his eyes, only just remembering to snap his mouthguard back on. So cool. Is there a size limit? Do you have to do the whole object or just part of it? How many things can you compress at one time? Inkblot just laughed. Wow, you really like quirks, don't you? Her grin took a naughtier turn. If you want to, you could give my quirk a full physical examination. She leaned closer to Mastermind, chest forward. Mastermind just flailed and blushed at that. Mr. Compress just shook his head. I'll go more in depth later, but for now that's the basics of my quirk. Inkblot, don't bother him too much. Inkblot just pouted. Spoil sport. She sprang up. Well, my quirk's cartoon, like those old black and white ones. It allows me to create anything I want from cartoons. Also gives me a bunch of cartoon powers, but nothing physics-defying. She pulled out a small black bottle and took a swig. Mr. Compress looked at her. Are you drinking at this time in the afternoon? Inkblot shook her head. Nah, it's ink. Mr. Compress stared at her. Ink? Inkblot grinned. Yeah, need to drink it to fuel my abilities. Plus it tastes good to me, you know? Golden Grin was next. Well, my quirk's pretty simple. It's called Mouth Laser. I build up power in my gut, and then I release it from my mouth. Took me a while to get it to the point where I don't feel like I'm crapping myself, though. Stitch was the last. My quirk's called Scalpel. He held out his finger. A tiny, shimmering blade made of purple energy formed on the edge of his finger. It's completely sterile and razor sharp. I can spread it out over my hand, but that dulls the edge. Gentle Criminal made a theatrical bow. You already know that my quirk is elasticity, don't you, Mastermind? When the villain nodded, he continued, I bestow elastic properties to anything I touch. It's gotten me out of many scrapes before. And if it isn't enough, I can help him. La Brava chirped. My quirk's called, love. Her cheeks reddened. If I declare that I love somebody, and I mean it, and we're close enough to hear, then I can give them a massive boost. I've always wondered how Gentle Criminal got away from those pro heroes in his videos, Mastermind gushed. Since it was always edited out, I never knew. You've got an amazing quirk, La Brava-san. La Brava waved her hands frantically. It's not that good a quirk. It doesn't last very long. And I can only use it once a day. That's still amazing, La Brava. Quirks that can help those you care about are pretty rare, you know. Mastermind continued to talk while La Brava turned bright red. Golden Grin just shrugged. Yeah, that's pretty neat, isn't it? He looked at Mastermind. So what's your quirk then, Mastermind? Mastermind froze up. Ah, Golden Grin continued talking. 'Cause it's gotta be like an electrical one, right? Or maybe it's a smoke quirk. You do like those smoke screens of yours. He looked at him. Or maybe it's a brain booster. 'Cause if you're a super genius, I could really use your help with homework. Mastermind shook his head. I don't have any of those quirks. Why is this still so hard to say? Mastermind took a deep breath. I am quirkless. The other villains looked at him more closely. What? Mastermind took a deep breath. I'm quirkless, all right? The visor went off and he took another bite of cake, chewing it to try and get around the feeling. Golden Grin blinked, trying to reshape the words he wanted to say. You don't have a quirk? Not even one like bendy fingers or something? When Mastermind nodded, he just stared back. Holy shit. Inkblot's eyes had grown to the size of dinner plates. You freaking dodged Eraserhead without a quirk? I think that made it easier, yes. Mastermind stabbed another piece of cake with his fork. But, you sure you're not a super genius from your quirk? Right. Mastermind put the fork back down. He then gently put his plate on his chair, then stood up and leaned in on Golden Grin. Mastermind put his mouth guard back on and opened up part of his visor. His green eyes narrowed, locked onto where Golden Grin's eyes were under his mask. Gentle Criminal had been floored before by things in his life, at failing to help that civilian, at being thrown out of his house, of being forgotten by a friend. But realizing that Mastermind was quirkless was pretty damn surprising. All this time, he'd thought that the young man had some quirk that powered his gadgets or helped make building them easier. His first instinct, admittedly, was pretty craven to try and dismiss Mastermind. But then he thought further. This young man, inexperienced as he was still a genius. Those machines of his were completely beyond Gentle's ability to even think about how to build them. And that planning, rough in parts maybe, but the kid had a gift. Golden Grin seemed about to say something further, only to be pinned in place by Mastermind glaring at him. What? What are you looking at me like that for? Believe me, I wish I had a quirk. It would have made a lot of things so much easier. There wasn't any flair in his voice. Gentle Criminal had never thought that Mastermind could even do quiet menace if he tried. Gentle Criminal could see that Mastermind's surprisingly green eyes were boring into Golden Grin's. The rather hapless criminal seemed to squirm in his chair. The golden-skinned villain tried to lean away, but couldn't. Why is it getting so hot? Hey, Gentle? He tried to look away, but seemed unable to. Did you turn up the thermostat or something? It's boiling in here. Gentle Criminal wasn't on the receiving end of that emerald glare, but even he felt like it had gotten a bit warmer. La Brava was slowly edging away from Mastermind and closer to Gentle. Inkblot had taken off her jacket. Even Mr. Compress seemed to be on edge. The other villains shifted in their chairs as Mastermind continued talking. Me and my mother went to about 10 different specialists. They tried every test in the book, and it all came up negative. One of them was using I-Island quirk diagnostic gear. Are you saying that they're all wrong? Sweat was pouring off the other villain. His eyes were darting around the room, trying to take his body with them. Eventually, he cried, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude. Please stop looking at me like that. I'm sorry. Mastermind instantly beamed at Golden Grin, then snapped his visor back on. Good. Glad to hear it. The other villains shared a look between them as Mastermind went back to his chair, sitting down primly. Golden Grin just slumped in his chair, sweat pouring off of him. What the hell was that? Mastermind seemed to smile. Oh, that was a long, hard stare. My mother taught me to do that for people who forgot their manners. He seemed to smile to himself. She tried it on a friend who swore in the house. He's never sworn in front of my mother again, and that's a real achievement. Then he bowed. I'm really sorry about that. I've never been able to get it to work off the stage. I mean, Mom gave me some tips, but I've never been able to do it properly. Golden Grin just laughed. Sure, it's fine. Just never look at me like that again, please. Gentle Criminal shared a look with Mr. Compress. Well, at least that was one thing they wouldn't have to teach him. Issue 7, Heroes and Villains, Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Bakugo Katsuki wasn't sure about a couple of things. That he was the greatest, that went without saying. Also, Deku was a gigantic nerd. That was also true. But lately, he'd been thinking about that damn sludge villain, how the guy had overpowered him with a cheap shot sneak attack, how he'd been choking to death while the heroes were only watching. And then that fucking mastermind douchebag saving him. He hadn't needed to be saved. He'd had the sludge villain right where he'd wanted him. So what if he'd barely been able to breathe? So what if he'd barely been able to move afterwards? And screw people who said that he'd been crying because he hadn't. He wasn't going to lose to a damn pile of crap like that. What he was confused about was that thing the goddamn hag had set up for them. That had also had his dad involved, a stubborn expression on his face. I'm signing us up for therapy, Katsuki. We kinda need it because you were nearly killed out there and we had to watch it on the fucking news. His mother had trapped him in a goddamn bear hug when he'd gotten home, and he hadn't wanted to break free, just couldn't be bothered with getting the hag off of him. I'd rather not see that happen if I can help it, Katsuki. And honestly, you need help just as much as we do, probably more. He'd scowled back then, had torn into her about it, that he wasn't weak enough to go to therapy. He didn't need any of that shit. But then, Bakugo Katsuki, you are going to a therapist, same as the rest of us. And if you don't go, his mother's face turned to a shark-like smirk, I'll tell Inko-chan about it, and then she'll get your stubborn ass in gear. So Bakugo had gone to the stupid therapist, mostly because he didn't need Midoriya-san to get involved. He didn't like feeling small when she glared at him. And the therapist, she had a job to do too, and Katsuki wasn't going to be rude to her any more than he'd be rude to a doctor. What? Bakugo wasn't such an asshole to mouth off at people who would keep a hero going like a support nerd doing costumes, like Izuku Deku. So he'd gone, and well, she'd not entirely been some damn extra. She was tolerable. Deku, that was the other thing that had been confusing him. Deku had been going out somewhere after school for the past month. The first month, he'd been going different routes. Not that Bakugo kept an eye on him or anything dumb like that. Let the damn nerd do whatever. He didn't care. Then the last week, he'd been going to one place. Bakugo had asked him politely where he'd been going. Oh, Kachan, the nerd had bubbled. I'm, doing some self-defense stuff. He looked down at his shoes. I got involved in a fight a couple of weeks ago, and it went badly for me, so I'm, going to a class to learn how to defend myself. Who the hell beat you up? I'll kick their ass. I'm the only one who gets to do that, Deku. He'd politely asked again, not because he was worried, but because anybody who thought they could mess with Bakugo's friend, annoying classmate, was going to fucking die. They would never find the body. But the nerd just shook his head. Some jerk at work. Didn't catch his name, but it's all right, Kachan. The nerd's face had fixed itself in that weird, determined expression again. I'm not going to lose to them again. Bakugo just scoffed. Whatever, nerd. And don't even think about getting in my way again, especially if you try to get into UA. You do that, and I'll kill you. Bakugo tried to think of something worse, followed it up with, and then I'll kill you again. You got that, you damn nerd. Deku, the useless fucker, just smiled and waved him off. Bakugo scowled, stomping off to the agreed-on spot for the therapist. Damn Deku, making him feel shit. The therapist was waiting for him. Good to see you, Bakugo-kun. The extra had introduced herself as something. Tomomi? Whatever. Glasses, Bakugo grunted, slouching into the chair and putting his feet up on the desk. Glasses simply pulled out a notepad and pen. Time to talk about feelings and shit. After that encounter with Eraserhead and that discussion over cake, I talked it over with Gentle and the others. I didn't really want to admit it, but they were right. As skilled as I was, as relatively cleanly as I had gotten away, I was still an amateur. Supervillains needed more than just luck to get away from pro heroes. I mean, sure, I knew that. All of my heists were carefully planned, but at my skill level, I couldn't get away from somebody like Eraserhead. That really got at me. It felt like I was backing down. But I knew that they were right. I had nearly lost, and there wasn't anything I could really do to change that. I could only acknowledge that I lacked experience and grow from there. So we decided that Mastermind had to lay low. While I was keeping my head down for a while, I was going to be getting some self-defense training from Gentle and the others. Which, well, I wasn't that bad in a fight, was I? Plus, I had support gear to build for my friends and myself. Mastermind's triumphant return couldn't be overshadowed or complicated by inferior support items in his partners. After all. In Gentle Criminal's garage, now repurposed as Mastermind's second laboratory, Labrava looked at Mastermind as he sighed, stepping back from the android and wiping his hands on a rag. All right, this is test 32 of the Deku. Here's hoping that it works. Mwah! After the obligatory roll of thunder, he pressed a button, watching the robot start to get up. The power cell is stable. Now time to see it move. He pressed the button on the pad. The machine stepped forwards, stiff and barely responsive. Then it toppled on the ground. Mastermind sighed, turning the robot off. And that's Deku Test 32, proving that it is a way to not build an accurate android duplicate of myself. Labrava looked over the robot. I don't get it. All the parts work correctly, right? Mastermind nodded, pulling open the head. Getting the movement of humans down is pretty hard. I'm going to check the code again. He inserted a wire into its head and linked it to his computer. Looking at the screen, he leant forwards, tapping at the keys and checking through the code. Interested, Labrava went over and looked at the code with him. After a few minutes of this and Mastermind's muttering, she turned to look at him. You wrote all of Mastermind. Mastermind nodded. Bits of it anyways. I'm not the best programmer. Labrava nodded. I can see that. There's a few parts that I think could be redone. Mastermind swiveled in his chair, looking at her. Labrava waved her hands around. I mean, there's whole functions that are linked in inefficient ways to the servos, and there's a bit of code spaghetti in there as well. But I'm sure that you know what. Labrava, what can I improve? Labrava spluttered, waving her hands around. What? I'm not. I mean, this is just... Mastermind scooted his chair closer. Labrava, it's okay. He spun around, pointing at the screen again. I mean, as I said, I'm not the best programmer. My area of expertise is more in, well, I don't really have one area. I'm a bit of a jack of all trades. I guess my best area is quirk analysis. He tapped the screen. I mean, I work hard and I guess I'm a genius, but there's people online who can just do things that I couldn't even dream about doing. Labrava flushed bright red as he got out of his chair. So please, Labrava, I may be Mastermind. A loud crack of thunder followed, but even my brilliance values different perspectives. Labrava stood there for a moment, hands clasped. Then she nodded to herself, a determined expression on her face. Right. She hopped into the chair, looking over the code. Well, let's see this bit here. Her hands blurred over the keyboard, adding bits here, deleting bits there. Mastermind watched, mouth running 1,000,000 miles a minute while he furiously wrote down the changes. Toshinori Yagi and Mirio looked out over the beach. Toshinori was sincerely impressed with the progress made. It's only been 5 weeks, but it's already looking better, Toshinori praised, clapping his arm around Mirio's shoulders. Just keep at it, and we'll be ready for you to take One for All in no time. True to his word, he'd been checking out the past wielders of One for All in his spare time to see how they had used the power. He'd continue looking up the past users. He just had a roaring feeling in his gut that he was getting to something important on the 4th. Mirio just nodded, a small smile on his face. I have to admit, it's unorthodox, but it's working. I feel a whole lot stronger already, Yagi-sensei. He pumped his arm, eyes sparkling with determination. Let's get back to it then. Before they could return to their work, a young and familiar voice rang out. Ah, Yagi-san, Mirio-san, good to see you. Toshinori and Mirio turned around to see young Midoriya run up to them, waving and smiling. Mirio went over to talk with the young boy, smiles all around. Toshinori just leaned back, enjoying the moment. Meeting an earnest young man like Midoriya was refreshing. That first time had been awkward for all parties all around, but soon the young man had become a small part of their lives. He wondered how the young man would fare in life. Would he be a policeman, a doctor, or would he be a fine hero like Mirio? Anything was possible for that young man. Toshinori was sure of it. Certainly, the young man was brighter than he'd been at that age. Midoriya was talking, gesturing as he talked about the thing he had been working on. So the project went really well, Mirio-san. It went so much better than I could have ever hoped for. But I've got some extra studying to do. I'm aiming for the support course in UA after all. Well, this was good news. Toshinori should have guessed from all of the materials he had been getting from the beach. That, and all of the tinkering he had seen the young man do. Toshinori had just supposed that it was part of the robotics club. He should have thought that the young man would want to try his talents elsewhere. It's quite a hard course to get into, I hear, Toshinori ventures. Some people say that it's almost harder to get in than the hero course. Toshinori had been brushing up with Nedzu about the various courses. He had brought up the subject after Midoriya had mentioned the importance of wearing gloves and having a first aid kit all that time ago. He felt that he needed to know more about teaching than just winging it. The principal had gone over what each course had to do to qualify. For heroics, Toshinori knew what qualified easily enough. For the business course, they had stringent exams and practical work regarding marketing opportunities. And for the support course, well, Toshinori wasn't worried for the young man, though. From his heart to his skills, he was sure that young Midoriya would make it into UA's support course. Midoriya Izuku turned to him and nodded, eyes sparkling and a small, determined smile on his face. Well, what's the point otherwise? Plus Ultra, after all. Toshinori just laughed, pumping a fist with young Mirio and Midoriya. Plus Ultra indeed. Mirio nodded with him. Yeah, I get that feeling working with Sir. He laughed about it good-naturedly. He's really pushing me with prediction. Midoriya tilted his head. Prediction? Mirio nodded. Yeah, it's actually a really important skill to develop with my quirk. Using my quirk at its fullest means that I'm blind and deaf with only the air in my lungs. Even stepping through a wall has a whole bunch of steps involved in the process. He tapped his finger against his temple rapidly. I need to know where everyone and everything will be around me when I go solid again, so by training my prediction abilities through experience, I've really improved. You should have seen me when I first started, he laughed again. I could barely go through a wall without accident. Midoriya looked at him with wide eyes, a smile on his face. Experience, he breathed, eyes on Mirio. Toshinori nodded. I have to agree. Sir Night-Eye knows more than anyone the value of foresight. His side ached, and he grit his teeth slightly. Believe me, I know. Mirio nodded. He's amazing. His biggest piece of advice, which I try to follow, is this. Always stay 3 steps ahead of your opponent. He nodded proudly. Keep that in mind, and you're sure to stay ahead of anything. Midoriya nodded, face shadowed by the setting sun. Thank you, Mirio-san. I'll keep that in mind for my future endeavors. Mastermind looked at his fellow partners in crime. Well, even though you described what your quirks are, I'd like to go a bit more in detail so that I can design support equipment that best suits you. Inkblot nodded, arms crossed. Makes sense. All right, let's get into it. She then reached her arm behind her back. Well, cartoon is pretty versatile. The more ink in my system, the higher quality stuff I can make, and more of it too. She pulled out the dark gray mallet again, waving it around. This was one of the first things I made, and well, it's a hammer. She swung it around, over her head, and smack into the concrete, shaking the ground slightly and leaving a near circular indent. She pulled the massive mallet up with one arm. Wow! Mastermind breathed. Is it heavy? Inkblot nodded. Feel it for yourself, dude. She gently passed the handle over to the shorter villain. He gripped it and tried to lift the hammer, only for the head to hit the ground. She chuckled. Yeah, it's pretty heavy. Taking it back with one hand, she idly spun it around like a cheerleader's baton before putting it back behind her. The other villains blinked a bit. Okay, where the hell does that go? Golden Grin asked. Inkblot shrugged. I know, it's just another part of cartoon, I guess. I keep all kinds of stuff there. Mastermind's eyes sparkled. You have a personal pocket dimension? That's incredible. Inkblot shrugged. As I said, cartoon has a whole bunch of benefits. She wiggled her arms in the air, the other villains watching as her noodle limbs flailed about, sometimes twisting nearly a full circle. I've got stretchy, noodle limbs, and I can stretch pretty far with them. To demonstrate, she reached over to Mastermind with a rubbery stretching noise, patting him on the head from a full 2 meters away. Also means that explosions and punches don't do too much to me. She paused, pulling out another bottle of ink. I just have to keep refueling if I do wackier stuff. Mastermind nodded, notebook out and handwriting blurring across the page. Uh-huh. So maybe if I can think of something that doesn't need you to have so much ink, maybe ink storage of some kind. Maybe some stuff that could fit in your pocket dimension. Inkblot nodded. The other weird thing about it is that my quirk's effects aren't as big on living things. Like, if I swung that hammer at your face, what do you think would happen? The other villains looked at each other. I'd die? Golden Grin spoke. Inkblot shook her head. Nah, you wouldn't. Believe me, any bombs I make level buildings just fine, but don't do much more than blow smoke in people's faces. That hammer blow? You'd be dizzy and disorientated, with little Tweety birds orbiting your head, but you wouldn't be dead. Which is a pretty good thing. Her grin faded a bit. I mean, I really don't want to kill people. Mastermind raised a hand. Is everything you make black and white? Inkblot shook her head. Nah, if I want color, I need to drink some other colors of ink. I just drink black, since it's my favorite. Mastermind blinked, writing down. So what does ink taste like to you anyway? Do different colors of ink taste different? Well, I mean, they obviously must given you have preferences. His hand was a blur as he wrote stuff down. But how much ink do you have to drink to get different colors? Are you limited by the colors you put into your body, or does it just come out in colors you want anyways? How much ink can you drink in one sitting? Does the ink go into the same space as your pocket dimension, or does it sit in your body? Inkblot laughed, slightly nervously. Well, I'll talk about it later. Maybe somebody else should show what they can do. Golden Grin laughed. Sure can. He stepped up, looking across the yard at the target they'd set up. You ready? When Mastermind nodded, he took in a deep breath. His mouth started to glow with a golden light. He then braced himself and then opened his mouth. A thick beam of golden light shot out at lightning speeds, hitting the target and punching through slightly as he bit the beam off. The last of the laser light dispersing around his mouth, he turned to the rest of them. Pretty sweet, right? Mastermind nodded. Really cool. How long did it take you to get that good with it? The other villain shrugged. A couple of months. Firing at targets, that kind of thing. My family's got a lot of people with laser quirks, after all. Inkblot and Mr. Compress shared a look. You, only hit the edge of the target, though, Mr. Compress pointed out, showing that the beam had barely hit the edge. Golden Grin looked away. It's pretty hard to aim, man, come on. I get the light in my eyes. Inkblot and Mr. Compress let out noises of understanding. Mastermind nodded, turning to a new page in his notebook and sketching away. I've got some ideas to help with that. How many times can you fire it in quick succession? Golden Grin shrugged. A fair few times, but then I need to cool down. Otherwise, I could blow up my stomach. I mean, used to be I would fire once and then I'd need a 5-minute breather. Now I can fire up to 7 shots before cooling down. Mastermind nodded. Is it a temperature issue? Does it have something to do with your core muscles? How does your stomach even work if the power builds up there? Do you digest food faster as a result of your laser stomach? Golden Grin tried to wave him down. One question at a time, man. Golden Grin had contributed in his own way for the villains, hauling some exercise equipment to Gentle Criminal's house that he swore just fell off the back of the moving truck. Mastermind panted, running on the treadmill with his armor on. Golden Grin stood to the side, head tilted to one side. Dude, why are you running in your armor anyways? I thought that this was like fitness stuff. Mastermind nodded. I wear this for every job, as a super villain. Designed it for all of this. Kind of need to be able to run in it. Golden Grin shook his head. Kind of crazy, man, but if it works, I guess. He watched as Mastermind came off the treadmill, passing the shorter man a bottle of water. He then turned to the treadmill. Guess you can't wear your armor outside, huh? 'Cause running on a track is really good for you. He turned on the treadmill and started running on it himself. Shame you don't have, like, body weights or something. That'd make it easier to go out and… Ah, I knew there was something to do. Mastermind snapped his fingers. Arm and leg weights so that I can simulate my armor outside in public. He started mumbling, clearly itching to go back to the lab. Maybe if I can swing it as an excuse to go outside and run on natural paths, I can. No way, Mastermind. Inkblot smacked him over the head. You're reasonably fit, but we've got to up your stamina and speed, so no tinkering until you're finished. Then, it's back to learning how to actually fight. Mastermind slumped. Aw. Grumbling a bit, he went over to the mat and started on his push-ups. Golden Grin shook his head. Crazy. Still, Mastermind hadn't gotten this far by being sane. Golden Grin just pushed on his own exercise routine. Sure, he wasn't quite as strong as Inkblot was, but he was still pretty good in a fight. Firing laser beams from your mouth is pretty dangerous. With how powerful his were, it didn't bear thinking about. They continued like this for a while, Mastermind running through routines and Golden Grin working hard as well, before Inkblot checked the time. All right, time for a break. Mastermind practically collapsed, breathing heavily. Inkblot leaned over, handing him a bottle of water. Tell you what then, you make these weights. We'll hit the park. Mastermind just nodded feebly, sucking in deep breaths to try and recover quicker. Gentle Criminal and Mr. Compress checked over the plans on the computer yet again. It's going to be pretty difficult even with Mastermind's proposed support gear, Gentle Criminal mused, hand-stroking his goatee. Mr. Compress nodded. Major jewelry stores like that are always hard to break, but that's where the fun is, after all. Stitch looked up from the medical textbook he'd brought from his clinic. The heroes are going to be in force, and once they realize that you're teaming up, they're going to mobilize more people. Gentle Criminal nodded. That's a risk to all of these ventures, but if it's to show people that these companies aren't the greatest in the world, then that's a fine price to pay. Stitch shrugged. I'm mostly going to be working on distractions anyway. He returned to his book. Still, considering that All Might has been seen more in Musutafu, we're going to be running the risk of bumping into the symbol of peace himself. Mr. Compress checked his gloves. We'll have to hope it doesn't come to that then. Mastermind just nodded. I mean, this plan is about as good as it can get, but if All Might shows up, he swallowed. Then it's over. I don't really have a plan for All Might beyond trying to tie him up in other areas. Gentle Criminal and Mr. Compress shared a look. Stitch was the first to speak up. I thought you were the master planner? Mastermind shook his head. Well, it's just not realistic to say that any one plan is the perfect plan. He looked down. People don't do exactly what you plan, so you work around that. You try to stay 3 steps ahead, keep them on their toes. Trying to plan around the number 1, with his experience, that's difficult. Stitch nodded. Exactly. Glad to hear you've got that straight. Especially about staying ahead of All Might and the heroes like that. Mastermind nodded in determination. The world of heroes may think that it's hard enough, but soon Mastermind and the… He scratched his head suddenly, lost in thought. We're going to have to come up with a cool villain team name, aren't we? Gentle Criminal raised a finger and opened his mouth, then closed it. He does have a point. Mr. Compress shrugged. Not good presentation if we don't have a uniting theme. The rest of the meeting was devoted to brainstorming various villain names. A whiteboard was called out, and markers scribbled over the surface, some names getting a vote and others getting lines drawn through them. Arguments broke out, but were thankfully quashed. Stitch left after an hour, citing a need to get back to his back alley clinic, but soon enough they had hammered out a name. It's catchy. I like it, Inkblot nodded. Gentle Criminal nodded as well. What a marvelous name. I would have preferred the Gentle Criminal subscriber army, but this will work as well. Okay, that's most of our prep done, Mastermind said brightly. Really? Golden Grin frowned. No, not really. Most of the support gear I'm working on isn't quite ready yet. Detective Tsukauchi looked over the various pieces of paper that comprised their information with the rest of the heroes and policemen. Death Arms was leaning forwards, expression interested. Mount Lady sat forwards, pen gripped tightly in her hand. Kamui Woods looked impassive as ever, arms crossed. So let's have a look at Mastermind's criminal activity. The projector changed slide, Tsukauchi pointing at each bit. The first incident at Makoto Industries. Mount Lady scowled at that. The villain broke in through the front door, then deployed an EMP, most likely from his quirk. He then stole several items of support equipment. All the stinking good stuff, probably. Mount Lady muttered, pen creaking in her grip, and then left the building from the front, making a grandiose declaration for the heroes to find him. A few minutes later, he goes over to a crime scene in progress. Another slide changed, showing a teenager being pulled out by a short man in armor. He deployed other devices, including what seems to be a freeze ray and a grappling hook. Note that there's no sign of his loot now. And then he escapes. Death Arms frowned, cracking his knuckles. About a week and a half later, and he strikes again at Kinzara Bank, just when another villain, another slide, this one showing Gentle Criminal's thumbnail for his video. Gentle Criminal and loyal subscriber team up, Kinzara Bank heist, along with security camera footage, was making his own move. The other heroes looked sympathetic, at least they'd gotten off light compared with those guys. Detective Tsukauchi continued, flicking through stills from the video. The pair of them were able to take out several pro-heroes and took the money as well, presumably to fund their next heists. They're certainly terrible, Kamui Woods muttered. And then the most recent incident. The slide changed again, showing the devastated storefront of Bespin Cakes. Mastermind showed up here in some form of vehicle with no registration number. He then proceeded to steal. The detective hesitated for a brief second, then rallied. Steal 40 cakes for purposes yet unknown, loading them up into the vehicle. He then engaged in a high-speed pursuit with police and heroes, but was able to shake pursuers. He then turned to the rest of the room. I got a report that he had been tracked by Eraserhead, but was able to shake him off using an improvised binding device. Murmurs broke out in the room. Detective Tsukauchi turned back to the monitor, clicking through it. Now, Mastermind has proven himself to not be just a typical villain for the link in the description. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment in the comment section if you want me to change anything.